Neil Hamilton was 46 years old and looked exactly like the kind of man people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. He drove an old gray Ford F-150, carried his lunch to work in a faded cooler bag, and spent Saturday mornings replacing furnace filters himself in their Brookfield, Wisconsin home. Most people around Vanessa believed she had outgrown him years ago. What they didn't know was that the man sitting at the center of Vanessa's special dinner announcement worked directly under Neil's authority at Great Lakes Med Supply. Neil stepped into the dining room. The smell of garlic butter and red wine hung thick in the air. Then he saw Ethan Brooks sitting at the head of his table while Vanessa slowly raised her wine glass and smiled. If you're watching from somewhere outside the U.S., drop your country and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow burn stories about betrayal, patience, and quiet revenge, subscribe now. Tomorrow's story gets even colder. The Hamilton house sat on a quiet street in Brookfield, 20 minutes west of downtown Milwaukee. Brick exterior, black shutters, 2 trimmed maple trees in the front yard that Neil had planted himself 11 years earlier when Emily was still in middle school. From outside, the house looked calm. Warm yellow light glowed through the dining room windows. Soft jazz floated faintly through the glass. Somebody inside laughed too loudly. Neil remained in the driveway for a few extra seconds, with one hand still resting on the steering wheel of his old Ford truck. The dashboard clock read 7:14 p.m. He watched shadows moving inside the house. Vanessa had told him there would be a few people over, nothing more. That alone had already told Neil something was wrong. Vanessa never undersold anything, not dinners, not vacations, not charity events, not herself. For the last 3 years, she had slowly transformed their life into something that looked curated instead of lived in. Their kitchen appeared in Instagram photos more often than actual meals happened there. Candles nobody was allowed to burn sat untouched on marble counters. Decorative books lined shelves in colors chosen to match the walls. The house had stopped feeling like a home somewhere around the same time Vanessa stopped asking how his day went. Neil killed the engine. Cold Wisconsin air rolled through the cracked window. Late October, the kind of cold that smelled faintly metallic after sunset. He grabbed the small paper bag from the passenger seat, a bottle of Cabernet from a local liquor store on Blue Mound Road. Vanessa had texted him 2 hours earlier, "Don't come empty-handed, we're having guests." No heart emoji, no please, just instructions. Neil stepped out of the truck and shut the door quietly. Inside the house, the music got louder as he approached. Frank Sinatra, "Fly Me to the Moon." Vanessa always played jazz when she wanted the evening to feel expensive. The front door was unlocked. Neil stepped inside and immediately smelled rosemary, garlic butter, and expensive perfume. Voices drifted from the dining room. Absolutely incredible opportunity. Scottsdale conference was amazing. Private donor circle. Neil hung his coat carefully on the hallway rack. Nobody came to greet him, not even the dog, because Vanessa had rehomed the dog 8 months earlier after deciding golden retrievers were too chaotic for the aesthetic of the house. Neil loosened his tie slightly and walked toward the dining room. The room looked staged. White linen tablecloth, crystal glasses, gold-trimmed plates Vanessa only used for appearances, tall candles flickering in the center of the table. 8 guests. Neil recognized most of them immediately. Doug and Melissa Harper from 3 houses down. Vanessa's friend Jenna Carlisle, who laughed before anyone finished speaking. Claire Bennett, sitting near the far end of the table, quiet as usual, fingers wrapped around a wine glass. And Ethan Brooks. Ethan sat at the head of the table, not beside Vanessa, at the head, as if the seat had been prepared for him. He wore a tailored navy suit without a tie, expensive watch visible beneath his cuff. Clean haircut, white teeth, the kind of practiced confidence Neil had seen dozens of times inside corporate meetings. For half a second, Ethan's face lost color. Only half a second. Then the smile returned. Professional, controlled, Neil, Vanessa said brightly, as if surprised he existed. You made it. Several guests turned toward him. Neil noticed his own chair had been moved. Not beside Vanessa anymore. Near the lower end of the table beside the kitchen entrance. Close to the serving dishes, convenient for getting things people needed. The detail was small, but deliberate. Neil understood deliberate things. Vanessa crossed the room and kissed the air beside his cheek without touching him. You're late, she said quietly. It's 7:14. Well, everyone else managed. Neil nodded once. No argument, no scene. That almost disappointed her. Vanessa liked reactions. Silence irritated her more than anger. Can you open the second bottle, she asked, already turning away. And we still need more ice. Not, how was work? Not glad you're home. Just tasks. Neil placed the paper bag on the counter and opened the wine bottle carefully. Across the room, Ethan stood. Good to finally meet you in person, Ethan said smoothly, extending a hand. A clean lie. They had already met twice through internal regional compliance reviews over video conference. Neil shook his hand anyway. Ethan's palm felt colder than expected. Likewise, Neil said. Their eyes locked briefly. Neil saw recognition there now. And concern. Small, controlled, but real. Claire noticed it too. Her eyes moved between them once before she took another sip of wine. Vanessa clapped lightly. Okay, everybody, sit before the food gets cold. Neil carried the wine to the table. Nobody helped him. The dinner started with roasted salmon, asparagus, and fingerling potatoes Vanessa had probably ordered catered, despite pretending she cooked everything herself. Conversation bounced around the table. Vacation homes, non-profit fundraising, Tesla stock, wine clubs. Neil ate quietly, mostly listening, mostly observing. Ethan talked the most. He had the kind of polished conversational rhythm built in conference rooms and airport lounges. Every story had perfect timing. Every joke arrived rehearsed, but effective. The guests liked him immediately. Vanessa watched that happen with visible satisfaction. Neil noticed the way she kept touching Ethan's arm when she laughed. Not accidentally, placed touches. Measured. Public. Claire barely touched her food. Twice Neil caught her glancing toward him with visible discomfort. But she said nothing. Nobody said anything. Because adults in wealthy suburbs often preferred discomfort over honesty. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa leaned back in her chair and smiled at the room. That smile. Neil knew it well. It was the same smile she wore before charity speeches and social media videos, the one that appeared right before performance. She lifted her wine glass slowly. The small spoon in her other hand tapped lightly against the crystal. Ting, ting, ting. Conversation faded. All eyes turned toward her. Vanessa glanced briefly at Ethan, then at Neil. There was excitement in her face now, almost relief, like someone finally reaching the final page of a script they had rehearsed too many times. I actually invited everyone here tonight for a reason, she said softly. Neil placed his fork down beside his plate. Ethan adjusted slightly in his chair. Claire's expression tightened immediately. Outside, wind brushed softly against the dining room windows. Vanessa smiled wider, and I think it's time everybody heard the truth. Vanessa let the silence settle first. She was good at that. Good at controlling rooms. Good at timing. Good at making people lean forward before she spoke. The candlelight flickered softly across the crystal glasses, while everyone waited for her next sentence. Neil sat still near the lower end of the table, one hand resting beside his untouched wine. Vanessa smiled carefully. I think she began that pretending things are perfect becomes exhausting after a while. Nobody moved. Doug Harper glanced briefly at his wife. Claire lowered her eyes toward her plate. Ethan kept his posture relaxed, but Neil noticed the tiny muscle tightening near his jaw. Vanessa inhaled slowly. For a long time, Neil and I have been living separate lives emotionally. We stopped being partners years ago. She laughed softly, almost sadly. I think we just got too comfortable pretending. There it was. Not divorce papers, not a private conversation, a performance. Neil watched her speak the same way he watched vendor presentations during compliance reviews, calmly, looking for preparation, looking for rehearsed phrases. Every sentence sounded practiced, every pause timed. Vanessa turned slightly toward Ethan, and over the last year, someone came into my life who reminded me what it feels like to actually be seen. Melissa Harper shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Jenna Carlisle whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Vanessa reached for Ethan's hand openly this time. No hesitation anymore, no hiding. "This is Ethan Brooks," she said warmly, "and he's made me happier than I've been in years." The room froze, not dramatically, quietly. The kind of silence adults create when nobody wants to be the first person to react. Neil looked at Ethan, really looked at him now. 34 years old, regional sales manager, strong quarterly numbers, good presentation skills, expensive suits, frequent travel reimbursements, pending internal review. Ethan cleared his throat gently. "This probably isn't easy for anyone," he said smoothly. "But life's short. Sometimes honesty matters more than comfort." Neil almost admired how polished the line sounded. Almost. Vanessa watched Neil carefully now, waiting, expecting anger, humiliation, some visible collapse she could point to later when retelling the story to friends. But Neil only reached for his napkin and folded it neatly once beside his plate. That unsettled her immediately. People who planned scenes hated silence. Ethan continued speaking. "Neil, I want you to know this wasn't something we intended to happen." Neil noticed Ethan's voice remained controlled, but his fingers tapped lightly against the stem of his wineglass between sentences. Tiny movements, tiny stress leaks. "We genuinely care about each other," Ethan said, "and I think everyone deserves to feel fulfilled." Claire finally looked up. Her expression had changed. Not shock anymore, discomfort. Because now the room understood this dinner had not been arranged for honesty. It had been arranged for witness reactions. Vanessa leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on Neil. "Well?" she asked softly. Neil met her gaze. "What exactly would you like me to say?" Vanessa blinked once. The question disrupted the structure she expected. "I don't know," she replied. "Maybe the truth, for once." Neil studied her for several seconds. The woman across from him barely resembled the person he married 22 years earlier in a small church outside Madison. Back then, Vanessa had laughed loudly at cheap diners and spilled coffee on herself during road trips. Back then, she used to hold his hand in parking lots without checking who might see. Now, every interaction looked managed, curated, filtered. Neil glanced briefly toward Ethan again. The younger man was trying very hard to maintain composure, but Neil could see calculations starting behind his eyes now, trying to predict risk, trying to read damage, trying to figure out how much Neil knew. Vanessa mistook Neil's silence for weakness. "You know," she said, reaching for her wine again, "people change. Some people grow. Some people stay exactly the same." Doug Harper stared hard at the table. Nobody wanted to be there anymore, but nobody wanted to leave first either, because leaving would mean admitting what this dinner really was. Neil spoke quietly. "I see." Vanessa gave a small shrug. "I didn't want to keep living dishonestly." That sentence almost made Neil smile. Not because it was funny, because 3 weeks earlier Vanessa had lied directly to his face about a charity strategy retreat in Chicago while using a credit card connected to their joint account. Dishonesty had never been the issue. Control had. Ethan leaned forward slightly now, deciding it was time to play the reasonable man. "Neil," he said carefully, "I know this hurts, but I hope eventually you'll understand this wasn't about disrespect." Neil looked at him directly. The room suddenly felt smaller, What was it about Ethan hesitated, only briefly. Connection, he answered. Neil nodded once. Outside, wind rattled faintly against the dining room windows. Somewhere deeper in the house, the refrigerator motor hummed softly. Normal sounds. Strange sounds for a moment like this. Vanessa crossed one leg slowly and smiled again, though the smile looked tighter now. You've been emotionally absent for years, Neil. He said nothing. You barely talk. Nothing. You work constantly. Still nothing. And honestly, Vanessa laughed lightly. Half the time, I don't even think people know what you actually do. That line drew a few uncomfortable smiles from around the table. Vanessa mistook those smiles for support. Neil noticed Ethan did not smile, not even slightly. Interesting, Vanessa continued. You're a good provider, a stable guy, but stability isn't enough forever. Neil watched Ethan carefully as Vanessa spoke. There, a flicker, very small. Ethan kept avoiding direct eye contact now, because somewhere underneath all the polished confidence he finally understood something had gone wrong tonight. Neil picked up his wine glass, but didn't drink. Instead, he asked quietly, You still report through Midwest operations? The sentence landed like a dropped knife. Ethan froze. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Claire to notice immediately. Enough for Neil to confirm what he already suspected. Vanessa frowned. What? Ethan forced a quick smile. Sorry, Neil kept his tone calm. Midwest operations. You still under Division 4? The room went silent again. Ethan's throat moved once before he answered. Yeah, technically. Interesting choice of word. Neil leaned back slightly in his chair. The candles reflected faintly in his eyes now. Vanessa looked between them, confusion beginning to replace confidence. How do you two even know each other? She asked. Neither man answered immediately. Ethan finally laughed softly. Corporate overlap, he said quickly. Big company. But Neil was already watching the panic build behind the younger man's expression. Small signs. Breathing shallower now, right hand flexing once under the table, the realization arriving piece by piece. Because Ethan Brooks had walked into this dinner believing Neil Hamilton was a forgettable middle-aged husband with a toolbox and an old truck. Not the man overseeing Midwest regional compliance reviews. Not the man currently holding an active internal audit file with Ethan's employee number attached to it. Neil rested both hands calmly beside his plate. Then he looked directly at Ethan and spoke in the same quiet voice. Then tonight may not be the best night for surprises. Ethan's smile stayed on his face, but it no longer fit. It looked placed there, like something taped over a crack. Vanessa stared at Neil with irritation first, then confusion. She had expected damage from him, a raised voice, a wounded question, maybe a broken plate if she was lucky enough to get something dramatic. Instead, he had spoken 7 calm words and changed the temperature of the room. Then tonight may not be the best night for surprises. No one knew what to do with that. Jenna Carlisle lifted her wine glass, then lowered it again without drinking. Doug Harper cleared his throat and reached for his water. Claire kept watching Neil. She knew him better than the others, though not well. For years, she had treated him like a quiet fixture in Vanessa's life. Reliable, dull, the man who fixed loose cabinet hinges during Thanksgiving and disappeared during arguments. Now she was seeing something else. Not anger, authority. Neil did not look at Vanessa after that sentence. He looked at Ethan. Only Ethan. And Ethan understood enough to stop performing for the room. I'm not sure what you're implying, Ethan said. His voice stayed smooth, but Neil heard the effort under it. That small strain people used when trying to sound casual, while mentally checking locks behind them. I didn't imply anything, Neil said. Vanessa gave a sharp little laugh. Neil, what are you doing? He finally turned his eyes to her. Listening. To what you invited me to hear. That landed harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as hard. Vanessa's lips pressed together. She looked down at the table, at the perfect plates, the candles, the expensive wine, the witnesses she had assembled. For the first time that evening, the setup began working against her. Neil could feel that shift. He did not enjoy it. That surprised him less than it might have surprised others. Revenge sounded hot when people imagined it. In real life, at least to Neil, it felt cold and precise, like entering numbers into a spreadsheet after a funeral. He looked back at Ethan. The name had first appeared in Neil's inbox on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks earlier. Subject line, expense pattern review, Division 4 sales. Neil remembered the exact time because he had been sitting in a glass-walled conference room at Great Lakes Med Supply headquarters near West Allis, drinking burnt coffee from a paper cup with the company logo on it. The report had come from Lydia Park in internal audit. It had been preliminary, quiet, not disciplinary yet, just patterns, and Neil lived by patterns. Ethan Brooks, Regional Sales Manager, Employee ID 44819, North Central Division. Strong growth numbers, excessive client entertainment charges, duplicate mileage claims between Milwaukee and Chicago, unusual weekend hotel expenses, repeated vendor contact outside approved contract windows. Nothing final, nothing dramatic, just enough to keep open. Neil had not disliked Ethan then. He had barely thought of him as a person. He was a line item, a file, a risk marker in a company that moved surgical gloves, cardiac monitors, infusion pumps, and sterile packaging across 6 states. The work was not glamorous. Vanessa had once called it hospital warehouse paperwork at a dinner party in Mequon. Neil had not corrected her. Correcting people took energy. Documentation worked better. 2 weeks after Lydia's report, Ethan had appeared in a regional video meeting. Clean haircut, bright office background, confident numbers. The kind of man who used words like momentum and relationship-driven growth. Neil had watched him present a chart showing a 14.8% increase in client conversions across northern Illinois. Then he had asked one simple question about vendor hospitality caps. Ethan had blinked, only once, but Neil noticed. Neil always noticed once. Now that same man was sitting at Neil's dining room table with his hand near Vanessa's wine glass. The absurdity of it might have been funny in another life. Vanessa broke the silence. "Can we not turn this into some weird work conversation?" she said. "This is personal." Neil looked at her. "It became personal when you put him at my table." Her face hardened. "My table, too." "Yes." The answer was soft, even respectful. That seemed to anger her more. Ethan shifted in his chair. "Look," he said, raising one hand slightly, "I don't want this to become hostile." Neil's eyes moved to that raised hand. No wedding ring, clean nails, expensive watch, Omega Seamaster. Neil had seen the reimbursement note for a client gift appreciation dinner on the same week Ethan's personal credit card statements showed a jewelry store payment Vanessa did not know Neil had seen. He filed the detail away. "Not for tonight. Not yet." "You don't want hostility," Neil said. "No, I don't." "Then answer plainly." Ethan's jaw tightened again. Neil leaned forward just slightly. "Are you still assigned to North Central under Division 4? Ethan glanced at Vanessa. A mistake, small but visible. Vanessa caught it this time. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means Neil said he knows the answer." The room remained painfully still. Finally, Ethan said, "Yes, I'm under Division 4, and your regional reporting chain runs through Midwest operations." "That depends on what you mean by reporting chain." Neil almost smiled. "Corporate evasions, always the same shape. If your expense approvals are flagged, where do they land?" Ethan said nothing. Neil did not fill the silence. He let it work. The candles burned lower in the center of the table. Wax slipped down one side in a slow white line. Vanessa looked at Ethan now, really looked at him. For the first time all evening, her confidence faltered. Not because she felt guilt. Neil saw no guilt there. What he saw was worse, in a quieter way. Embarrassment. the horror of losing control in front of her own audience. "Ethan," Vanessa said, voice tight, "what is he talking about?" Ethan gave a short laugh. "He's making it sound more dramatic than it is." Neil picked up his water glass and took one slow drink. He could feel every person at the table watching him. He wished Emily were not away at the University of Wisconsin that weekend. Then immediately he was grateful she was. Their daughter had inherited Vanessa's expressiveness and Neil's habit of noticing too much. This would have cut her deeply. At least she was spared the room, for now. Doug Harper leaned back slightly. "Neil," he said carefully, "I'm sorry, but do you two work together?" Vanessa answered before Neil could. "No, Neil works in operations. Ethan is in sales. It's a huge company." Neil set down his glass. "Great Lakes Med Supply has 2,700 employees across the Midwest region," he said. "That part is true." Vanessa looked relieved for half a second. Then Neil continued. "But North Central sales reports through the regional compliance structure when contract risk, vendor irregularities, or expense reviews are involved." Ethan's face went flat. There it was, the end of pretend confusion. Neil saw the moment clearly. Ethan knew now that Neil did not merely recognize him. Neil knew the file, knew the chain, knew the pressure points. Vanessa heard only fragments. Compliance, vendor, expense. Enough to make her uncomfortable, not enough to understand. Claire understood more than Vanessa did. Her hand had tightened around the stem of her wine glass. "Neil," Claire said softly, "are you saying Ethan reports to you?" Neil kept his eyes on Ethan. "I'm saying his current review does." Ethan pushed his chair back an inch. The sound scraped against the hardwood floor, too loud. Everyone flinched slightly. Ethan noticed and forced himself still. "Review," Vanessa repeated. Neil turned to her then. "Yes, what review?" "That's not dinner conversation. You just made it dinner conversation." "No," Neil said. "You did." The words were quiet enough that nobody could accuse him of cruelty. But they had weight. Vanessa felt that weight. Her cheeks flushed, though she tried to hide it by lifting her glass. Ethan leaned forward. "Neil, with respect, you're crossing a line." Neil looked back at him. "With respect, Ethan, you may want to remember where the lines are." That was the first sentence of the evening that made Ethan visibly angry. His eyes sharpened, the polished charm thinned. For one moment, Neil saw the man under the suit, not the motivational sales manager, not the guest of honor, a younger man who had believed charm could carry him past every locked door. Neil knew that kind of man. Companies were full of them, so were divorce courts. Vanessa placed her wineglass down a little too hard. "Enough," she said. "This is ridiculous. You're trying to intimidate him because you're hurt." Neil absorbed the accusation without reacting. He was hurt. That part was true. His chest had felt hollow from the moment he saw Ethan at the head of the table. Not shocked, not exactly. The evidence had been gathering for months. But there was a difference between knowing a house had termites and watching the beam crack above your head. Still, pain was not an instruction. Pain was not a plan. Neil had learned that young from a father who fixed school buses in Green Bay and measured every board twice because wood did not care how angry a man was. Neil breathed once, slowly. Then he said, "I'm not intimidating anyone." Ethan gave him a hard stare. "No, no." Neil rested his hand beside the plate. "I'm asking whether Mr. Brooks understands that certain relationships create disclosure obligations inside a corporate reporting chain." Nobody spoke. Disclosure obligations. The words sounded dry, almost boring, but Ethan's face changed again, because boring words were often the dangerous ones. Vanessa's brow furrowed. "Relationships," she said. "What obligation were adults?" Neil nodded. "You are." The answer left no space to argue. Ethan ran his tongue briefly along the inside of his cheek. Then he smiled again. A smaller smile now, controlled damage. I think there's some confusion here, Ethan said to the table. Neil's role may touch different departments, but he's not my boss, in any normal sense. Neil looked at him for 3 quiet seconds, then 4. The room waited. Neil finally said, "That depends on what happens Monday." Ethan stopped breathing for half a beat. Monday. The word moved through him like a current. Neil saw it. Claire saw it. Vanessa did not. Not fully. She only heard a threat where Neil had stated a date. "What happens Monday?" she demanded. Neil picked up his napkin and placed it neatly beside his plate. He had not planned to bring company business into his home, but then he had not planned the seating chart either. He looked from Vanessa to Ethan and back again. "There is a scheduled compliance discussion at 9:30 Monday morning," he said. "Mr. Brooks was notified this afternoon." Ethan's hand tightened around his glass. Vanessa turned sharply toward him. "You didn't tell me that." Ethan did not answer her. Neil watched the silence land between them. A new silence now, not public embarrassment, private fracture, small but real. Vanessa's perfect table had begun to split along a seam she had not known existed. Neil stood slowly. His chair legs made almost no sound. "I think," he said, "before anyone makes another speech about honesty, we should be careful what gets said tonight." He turned toward the hallway leading to his study. Behind him, nobody spoke, but he heard Ethan's chair shift again, this time not with confidence, with fear. Neil walked only as far as the hallway entrance before Vanessa's voice stopped him. "Oh my God, would you stop doing that?" He turned slightly. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured sharply toward the dining room. "The cryptic corporate intimidation thing." Neil looked at her for a moment. The candles behind her softened the edges of her face, but not the tension underneath it. She was losing control of the evening 1 inch at a time, and she hated uncertainty more than conflict. "I'm not intimidating anyone," Neil said again. Ethan stood from his chair halfway, then stopped. "Neil," he said carefully, "maybe we should talk privately." Interesting. Not 5 minutes earlier, Ethan had been willing to announce a relationship across Neil's dining table in front of strangers. Now he wanted privacy. Neil noticed Claire watching that contradiction settle into the room. "No," Neil said calmly. "Private would have been before tonight." Vanessa crossed her arms. "You're acting ridiculous, and you invited your boyfriend into my house." "Our house." Neil nodded once. "Yes." The answer frustrated her again because it carried no heat, no accusation, no shouting she could defend herself against later. Doug Harper shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should head out," he muttered quietly to his wife. But nobody moved. The room had become too tense to interrupt naturally. Everyone felt it, like standing too close to train tracks, waiting for impact. Vanessa exhaled sharply and forced a smile toward the guests. "Neil works in operations," she said lightly, almost laughing. "He's making this sound more dramatic than it is." Neil remained still. She continued. "He reviews spreadsheets and warehouse reports all day. Ethan handles actual client relationships." The sentence hung there. Actual client relationships. Neil had heard versions of that line for years, at parties, fundraisers, holiday dinners. Vanessa always described his work in ways that made it sound smaller than hers, not because she understood what he did, because she never cared to. Neil managed regional compliance for 6 states and nearly $800 million in medical supply contracts. He oversaw internal investigations tied to hospitals, vendor fraud risks, reimbursement approvals, inventory diversion cases, and federal reporting standards. 3 vice presidents answered to the reports his department generated. But Vanessa preferred telling people he handled logistics. It fit her version of the marriage better, a stable husband with practical shoes and an old truck beside her polished life. Neil looked at Ethan. The younger man understood the truth perfectly. That was the difference. "Operations," Ethan said carefully. "That's a broad term." Neil saw what he was trying to do. Reduce clarity, create vagueness, a classic survival instinct. Claire finally spoke. "What exactly do you do, Neil?" The question shifted the room again, not because of the words, because it was the first honest question anyone had asked all evening. Vanessa rolled her eyes lightly before Neil answered. "He manages regional systems or something." Neil ignored her. "Vendor oversight," he said simply. "Compliance review. Regional Operations Authority." Silence. The phrasing sounded dry, technical, but authority was the word people heard. Vanessa laughed softly. "There you go again." Neil turned toward her. "What part was inaccurate?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out immediately. Ethan stepped in quickly. "Neil supports the operational side," he said. "Sales works separately." Neil nodded. "Mostly." That one word tightened Ethan's shoulders immediately. Doug Harper leaned forward slightly. "So wait," he asked carefully, "you actually review sales divisions?" Neil looked at him. "When required." Vanessa scoffed. "This is unbelievable." Neil almost asked which part. Instead, he sat back down slowly at the table. Not at the head, not beside Vanessa. At the lower end where she had placed him, but now the position looked different somehow, like the room itself had quietly rearranged around him. Jenna Carlisle cleared her throat. "So, Ethan really works under your company structure," Ethan answered too quickly. "It's a massive corporation. Everybody technically overlaps somewhere." Neil watched him carefully. Too fast, too defensive. Fear accelerated speech patterns. Neil saw it constantly during internal interviews. Vanessa reached for her wine again. "You're all acting like Neil runs the Pentagon." Nobody laughed. That bothered her too. Claire spoke softly without taking her eyes off Ethan. "Then why are you sweating?" Everyone looked at Ethan immediately. A mistake. Tiny beads of sweat had formed near his temple, despite the cool temperature in the room. Ethan forced a laugh and loosened his collar slightly. "It's warm in here." No one answered. Neil noticed Melissa Harper glance toward the hallway, as if calculating the politest possible exit. But still, nobody stood. Because now curiosity had replaced discomfort. People sensed there was more under the surface, and human beings rarely walk away from tension when they think revelation is close. Vanessa straightened in her chair. "I think everyone's losing perspective," she said sharply. "This dinner was about honesty." Neil folded his hands together loosely. "Honesty would have involved timing. What does that mean?" "It means introducing your affair partner to your husband after seating him at the head of the table isn't honesty." The sentence landed hard. Several guests looked down immediately. Vanessa's face flushed. Ethan shifted again. Neil continued calmly. "It's theater." Vanessa stared at him. "You know what your problem is?" Neil waited. "You think silence makes you smarter than everyone else." "No," Neil said. "Silence gives people room to reveal themselves." That shut the room down again. Claire slowly lowered her wine glass onto the table. Neil could almost see the evening splitting apart in her mind now. Before tonight, she had probably believed Vanessa's version of the marriage completely. Neil, the emotionally absent husband. Vanessa, the trapped woman rediscovering herself. Simple stories always sounded cleaner before details entered. Ethan leaned forward again. "Look," he said carefully, "whatever issue exists between Vanessa and you, I don't think bringing work into it helps anyone." Neil studied him quietly. The expensive suit, perfect haircut, measured voice, a man trained to sell confidence. But confidence had limits once documentation existed. "Did you disclose the relationship?" Neil asked. Ethan froze again. Vanessa frowned. "Disclose to who?" Neil did not look at her. "Company policy requires disclosure when personal relationships create influence, concerns inside a reporting structure." Ethan answered quickly. "We're not in the same reporting structure." Neil tilted his head slightly. "Your mileage approvals route through Division 4 oversight. That's procedural." "Still reporting." Ethan's jaw flexed. Vanessa finally snapped. "Oh my God, enough with the corporate language." Neil looked at her then. For someone who keeps saying this is about honesty, you seem uncomfortable with specifics. That hurt her, not emotionally, socially. Neil could see the embarrassment building behind her eyes now. She had planned admiration tonight, liberation, maybe sympathy. Instead, the room had become uncertain territory. The story no longer belonged entirely to her. Doug Harper rubbed his forehead slowly. "So what exactly happens Monday?" he asked carefully. Ethan spoke before Neil could. "Nothing important, another mistake. Too fast again." Neil looked directly at him. "You seem very confident for someone scheduled for a compliance interview." Vanessa's head turned sharply. "Interview?" Ethan forced a smile. "It's routine." Neil said nothing. Silence again. Silence was becoming unbearable for Ethan now, because every quiet second forced him to imagine how much Neil knew. And Neil knew enough. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Claire finally asked the question nobody else wanted to. "Ethan, does Neil have authority over your review?" Ethan hesitated. Neil watched the exact moment calculation failed. Too many witnesses, too many half-truths already colliding. "Yes," Ethan admitted finally. "Indirectly." Vanessa blinked, what Ethan immediately tried recovering. "It's not like he's my direct boss, but he's involved." Claire pressed. Ethan looked trapped now. Neil almost pitied him for half a second. Almost. "Regional compliance signs off on certain escalations," Ethan said carefully. Claire leaned back slowly. "Oh." That single word changed the room more than shouting would have. Now everyone understood the shape of the problem. Vanessa stared at Ethan with visible confusion. "You told me he worked in warehouse operations." Ethan looked at her. Neil noticed it immediately. Not concern, annoyance. Because Ethan realized she had misunderstood Neil completely. And worse, Ethan had allowed it. Neil sat quietly while the silence spread again. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the front windows as a car passed through the neighborhood. Inside the dining room, nobody touched their food anymore. The salmon had gone cold. Wine sat unfinished. Vanessa looked between both men, trying to regain footing. "This is insane," she whispered. Neil finally reached for his water again. "No," he said quietly. "It's organized." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Neil saw anger arriving now beneath the fear. Good. Anger made people careless, and careless people usually told the truth faster. Claire looked directly at Ethan. "Did you know who Neil was before tonight?" Nobody moved. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again, and Neil realized something important. Ethan had expected humiliation tonight, just not his own. Nobody at the table looked away from Ethan, not even Vanessa, especially not Vanessa. The question Claire had asked hung over the dining room like smoke. "Did you know who Neil was before tonight?" Ethan's confidence cracked in tiny places first. A blink too long, a jaw tightening, his fingers pressing once against the edge of the tablecloth. Then he smiled again. But now the smile looked exhausted. "I knew he worked at Great Lakes," Ethan said carefully. "I didn't know the extent of his involvement with compliance." Neil watched him choose every word. Interesting. Not "I didn't know who he was," not "I had no idea," just the extent. Corporate language again, partial denial, controlled exposure. Claire noticed too. "You recognized him immediately," she said quietly. Vanessa turned sharply toward Ethan. "You told me you'd never met him." Ethan looked at her quickly. "I said we weren't connected personally." Neil could almost hear the younger man recalculating every sentence in real time now. The room had stopped being social. It had become procedural. Neil knew that atmosphere well. Conference rooms, internal investigations, vendor hearings. The moment people realized details mattered more than charm. Vanessa gave a nervous laugh. "This is insane. You're all acting like Ethan committed a crime." "No one said crime," Neil replied. The distinction mattered. He saw Ethan react to it immediately. Because Ethan understood corporate risk language. Misconduct and criminality were different categories. One destroyed careers faster than the other. Doug Harper rubbed both hands together awkwardly. Maybe everybody just needs to cool down. But nobody moved toward cooling down. Neil stood slowly from his chair. The movement drew every eye again. Vanessa straightened immediately. What now? Neil ignored the tone. I need something from my study. Ethan spoke too quickly. That's really unnecessary. Neil looked at him. I haven't decided that yet. Then he walked toward the hallway. Behind him, nobody resumed eating. The house felt strangely quiet outside the dining room. The farther Neil moved from the table, the more clearly he could hear the small sounds underneath the evening. The dishwasher humming softly in the kitchen, the furnace clicking on somewhere downstairs, wind brushing against the siding outside. Normal house sounds. Sounds that belonged to ordinary nights. Not this one. Neil entered the study and closed the door halfway behind him. The room smelled faintly like paper and cedar. Unlike the rest of the house, the study still looked lived in. Real bookshelves, old framed photographs. Emily's middle school basketball picture near the desk lamp. Filing cabinets organized with clean labels. Vanessa rarely entered the room anymore. She called it the office cave. Neil crouched beside the lower cabinet and unlocked the second drawer with a small key from his pocket. Inside sat 3 gray folders. He already knew which one he wanted. Employee Review Brooks Ethan. He rested his hand on the folder for a moment before lifting it. Not because he hesitated, because he was tired. That surprised him again tonight. He expected anger when this day eventually arrived. Rage. Something explosive. Instead, he mostly felt exhausted. 22 years of marriage reduced to candlelight theater and rehearsed speeches over cold salmon. Neil opened the folder. Inside were copies only, never originals. Neil did not move recklessly with company material. The folder contained organizational charts, regional reporting structures, reimbursement review, notices, signed compliance acknowledgement forms, and one pending audit summary sheet. Nothing confidential enough to violate policy, just enough truth to remove ambiguity. Neil closed the folder again, then paused. On the desk sat another photograph. Emily at 16 beside Vanessa during a charity fundraiser downtown, both smiling. Vanessa had looked genuinely happy that night. Or maybe Neil had only believed she was. He picked up the folder and returned toward the dining room. Conversation stopped the second he appeared. Ethan's face lost color immediately. There it was. Real fear now. Neil noticed the exact place Ethan's eyes landed first. The gray tab at the top of the folder. Not the guests. Not Vanessa. The folder. Neil resumed his seat calmly. Vanessa folded her arms. This is unbelievable. Neil placed the folder carefully beside Ethan's wine glass. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just placed it there. The printed label faced upward. Internal review documentation. Ethan stared at it without touching it. Claire inhaled sharply. Doug Harper muttered, Jesus. Vanessa looked between them. What is that? Neil answered without emotion. Documentation connected to an active compliance review. You brought work files to dinner. You brought the subject of the review to dinner. That shut her down again. Ethan finally reached toward the folder but stopped before touching it fully. You can't share internal records, he said quietly. I haven't. Neil opened the folder himself. Slowly, controlled. Inside were only a few pages, visible organizational hierarchy, reporting chain diagrams, approval signatures division, oversight structure, no private financial details, no investigation notes, no disciplinary recommendations. Neil rotated one page slightly toward the center of the table. At the bottom sat a signature line. Neil Hamilton, Regional Operations Compliance Director. Vanessa blinked, then looked at Neil fully for what felt like the first time all evening. What is that title? Neil met her eyes. My job. Silence. Not one person moved. Vanessa stared at the page again. You never said, you never asked. That one hurt her. Neil saw it land immediately, because it was true. Over 22 years, Vanessa had asked about promotions only when salary changed, asked about meetings only when travel affected her schedule, asked about work only when it connected to appearances. Neil had stopped volunteering details years ago, not out of secrecy, out of absence. Ethan leaned forward suddenly. We should talk privately, now. Neil looked at him calmly. No, this has gone far enough. You announced a relationship at my dinner table. That's different. How Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out immediately. Claire looked away slightly. Even Jenna Carlisle seemed embarrassed now. Vanessa pushed her chair back sharply. So this is revenge, she snapped. That's what this is. Neil turned toward her slowly. If I wanted revenge, Vanessa tonight would look very different. The room went completely still after that sentence, because everyone believed him, including Ethan. Neil closed the folder halfway. I have not disclosed confidential findings, he said evenly. I have not discussed disciplinary recommendations. I have not violated company procedure. Ethan's breathing had become visibly shallower. But you're implying something. No, Neil replied. The paperwork implies something. Claire quietly asked Ethan, what exactly are they reviewing? Ethan answered immediately. Routine expense documentation. Neil watched him carefully. Another partial truth. The most dangerous kind. Vanessa looked relieved for half a second. Then Neil spoke. Routine reviews don't usually involve regional compliance escalation. Vanessa's head turned sharply again. What does that mean? Neil looked at Ethan first, giving him one opportunity, one clean chance. Ethan kept his jaw tight and stayed silent. So Neil answered. It means the review expanded. Doug Harper leaned back heavily in his chair. Oh boy. Vanessa looked between them again, struggling now to understand where the danger actually was. Her original script had collapsed completely. Neil could see it. She no longer knew who held information and who didn't. That loss of control terrified her more than the affair itself. You're trying to humiliate him, she accused. Neil shook his head once. No. Then what are you doing? Neil looked at the folder, then at Ethan, clarifying the room. Ethan finally snapped slightly. This is completely inappropriate. Neil's eyes remained calm. You know what would have been appropriate. Ethan said nothing. Disclosure. The word hit harder this time, because now the paperwork sat visible between them. Vanessa frowned. What disclosure? Neil answered without looking away from Ethan. The kind required when someone in a regional reporting structure enters a personal relationship connected to an active compliance review. Claire slowly whispered, Oh my God. Vanessa looked at Ethan immediately. You said this was nothing. Ethan forced another smile. It is nothing. Neil noticed sweat collecting near his collar now. The younger man was beginning to realize the worst part of the evening was not exposure, it was uncertainty. He still did not know how much Neil knew about Chicago, about Marissa Grant, about the reimbursements, about the duplicate mileage claims. Neil had not mentioned any of that yet, and Ethan understood that, which meant every silence now felt dangerous. Neil rested one hand lightly on the folder, then he asked quietly, Vanessa, did Ethan ever tell you about the Chicago vendor weekend? The room froze instantly. Ethan's face changed completely, not anger now, panic, pure panic. Vanessa looked at him slowly. What Chicago weekend? Neil did not answer her. He kept his eyes on Ethan, and Ethan finally looked like a man who understood the floor beneath him might not hold much longer. Vanessa looked at Ethan as if the room had suddenly tilted beneath her chair. What Chicago weekend? Ethan recovered quickly, too quickly. Business trip, he said. Nothing more. Neil noticed the answer arrived before the question finished settling. Fast answers usually meant rehearsed thinking. Vanessa frowned. You told me you were in Minneapolis that weekend. There it was, a mistake neither of them had planned for publicly. Ethan's eyes flicked toward Neil again. only for a second. But Neil saw something different there now, not just fear, resentment, because Ethan finally understood the real danger of the evening. It was not that Neil knew about the affair, it was that Neil knew things outside the affair, corporate things, documented things, verifiable things, and those things did not disappear because people raised their voices. Neil rested one hand lightly on the folder. "I'm not discussing confidential findings," he said calmly. Vanessa snapped toward him. "Then stop speaking in riddles." Neil met her eyes. "You invited him into our house without telling me. Our marriage was already dead. That isn't the point." "Yes, it is." "No," Neil said quietly. "The point is, you built tonight around humiliation. You just didn't expect uncertainty." Vanessa stared at him. The sentence hit because it was accurate. Neil had watched her organize the evening carefully from the moment he entered the house. The seating arrangement, the announcement speech, the public framing of emotional neglect, everything structured so the room would instinctively side with her before Neil ever spoke. But now the room no longer knew where to stand. That frightened her. Claire leaned forward slightly. "What exactly happened in Chicago?" Ethan answered before Neil could. "A vendor conference." Neil looked at him calmly. "Which vendor?" Ethan hesitated. Tiny pause. Too long. "Several attended." "Which vendor hosted the dinner?" Another pause. Vanessa noticed now. Neil saw her beginning to understand something important. Ethan only sounded confident when nobody checked details. Doug Harper muttered quietly, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. Neil opened the folder again. Only enough to remove one sheet. Nothing confidential. A printed organizational chart. Division 4 Sales Oversight. Names, reporting structures, approval chains. Neil slid the paper slowly toward the center of the table. "Public corporate structure," he said. "No restricted information." Ethan's jaw tightened. Vanessa leaned forward. For the first time all evening, she actually looked interested in Neil's work. Too late. Her eyes scanned downward until she found his name. Neil Hamilton, Regional Operations Compliance Director. Below it, North Central Sales, Escalation Review, Authority. And beneath that, Ethan Brooks, Regional Sales Manager. Vanessa stared at the page. "You supervise him," Neil answered carefully. "Not directly, but his division falls under my escalation authority during compliance review." The wording mattered. Neil chose words the way surgeons chose instruments. Precisely. Claire looked at Ethan. "So when you said Neil was just operations..." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "It's complicated." "No," Neil said quietly. "It isn't." The room went silent again. Outside, rain had begun lightly tapping against the dining room windows. Wisconsin weather moving in fast across the suburbs. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "You're trying to destroy him because of us." Neil looked at her steadily. "If I wanted to destroy him, Vanessa, tonight wouldn't involve paperwork. It would involve legal." That changed the air immediately. Ethan's breathing slowed for a moment. Not calmer, careful. Neil recognized the shift. People became cautious once they realized a situation might become official. Jenna Carlisle finally stood halfway from her chair. "I really think maybe we should leave." Nobody answered her, because nobody wanted to miss what came next. Human curiosity overpowered social instinct every time. Neil looked at Ethan again. "You requested reimbursement for Chicago under vendor engagement classification." Ethan stared back. Neil continued. "The report included hotel upgrades and weekend mileage outside approved routing." Vanessa's eyes moved sharply toward Ethan. "You said the company paid for everything." "It did." Neil tilted his head slightly. "Not exactly." Ethan's composure cracked visibly now. "This is inappropriate." "You've said that twice," Neil replied. "Still doesn't change documentation." Vanessa's voice sharpened. What documentation? Neil did not answer immediately. Instead, he removed another paper from the folder. Not financial data. Just a reimbursement summary sheet with sensitive details blacked out. Dates remained visible. Chicago, Saturday through Monday, vendor hospitality category, mileage discrepancy flag. Vanessa leaned closer automatically, then stopped. Her expression changed, not heartbreak, calculation. Neil saw her doing math in real time now. Dates, excuses, trips, stories. She was with me that weekend, Vanessa said suddenly. The sentence came out defensive instead of confident. Neil looked at her quietly. Was he? Vanessa turned sharply toward Ethan. You said you were in Minneapolis until Sunday night. Ethan stood abruptly. The chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. That's enough. Nobody else moved. Neil remained seated. The difference in posture mattered. One man escalating physically, one remaining still. Neil had spent years inside disciplinary meetings. Stillness unnerved guilty people more than aggression. Ethan pointed toward the folder. You're abusing your position. No, Neil said. I'm clarifying mine. That's a threat. No, a threat would involve consequences. This is context. Doug Harper slowly rubbed both hands over his face. This dinner is insane. Vanessa stood too now. Neil, stop talking like a lawyer and explain what's happening. Neil looked up at her. You introduced a man into this house who's currently under review by my department. That doesn't explain Chicago. It explains why details matter. Vanessa's voice rose. Did he sleep with someone there? Silence. Ethan looked away first. That was enough. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Jenna whispered, "Oh my God." Neil watched Vanessa carefully now, not out of cruelty. Observation. She had spent the first half of the evening performing confidence, performing liberation, performing superiority. Now the performance had collapsed into raw uncertainty, and uncertainty made people dangerous. Answer me, Vanessa demanded. Ethan exhaled sharply. It wasn't like that. Neil almost sighed. That sentence usually meant exactly like that. Vanessa stared at him. Then what was it like? Ethan ran one hand through his hair. Marissa Grant was there. Neil noticed the exact moment Vanessa realized she had never heard the name before. Who's Marissa Grant, vendor representative? Neil said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence around the name did enough work. Vanessa's face hardened slowly. You told me you hated those vendor dinners. Ethan's voice became defensive. I do. Then why were you sharing hotel upgrades with one I wasn't sharing? He stopped too late. Claire looked down at the table immediately. Doug Harper muttered another curse under his breath. Neil remained perfectly still. People often revealed more trying to deny things than admitting them outright. Vanessa took one step backward from Ethan. Just one. But Neil noticed. Ethan noticed too, and fear deepened behind his eyes, because now he was losing both sides of the room at once. Vanessa looked toward Neil suddenly. You knew all this. Neil answered honestly. I knew enough to keep looking. How long? Neil thought for a moment. Long enough. The rain outside intensified. Water streaked down the dining room windows, now blurring the neighborhood lights beyond the glass. The room felt smaller, warmer, airless. Neil could smell extinguished candle smoke where one flame had died unnoticed. Ethan looked at him carefully. Something colder entered his expression now. You planned this. Neil shook his head once. No, you knew about us, yes, and you waited. Neil held his gaze. Yes. Vanessa stared at Neil in disbelief. You just sat there pretending not to know. Neil looked at her quietly. No, I sat there gathering facts. The sentence landed heavily, because unlike Vanessa's speeches or Ethan's charm, facts did not depend on emotion. They survived embarrassment. They survived arguments. They survived denial. Neil stood slowly from his chair. Again, no sudden movement, no anger. He closed the folder carefully. The affair isn't why Ethan's review exists, he said calmly. But the relationship should have been disclosed once it intersected reporting authority. Ethan laughed once. Short, bitter. You really think this company cares who I date? Neil looked directly at him. No. Then he paused. But they care very much about people who hide things during active compliance review. The room went completely silent. Even the rain seemed quieter for a moment. Vanessa looked back and forth between them, finally realizing she no longer understood the scale of the situation. And Ethan realized something worse. Neil still had not shown the most dangerous documents yet. The rain outside thickened into a steady Wisconsin downpour. Water rolled down the dining room windows in crooked silver lines, while nobody at the table touched their food anymore. The candles had burned low enough that melted wax pooled around the bases like pale glue. Vanessa remained standing beside her chair. "So who exactly is Marissa Grant?" she asked again. Ethan rubbed one hand across his mouth before answering. "A vendor representative." "You already said that. It's business." Neil watched the younger man carefully. Ethan's confidence now came in waves. Small recoveries followed by visible panic. His breathing kept changing rhythm, shoulders tightening whenever silence lasted too long. Neil had seen the same pattern during internal interviews before termination meetings. People lied best while speaking. Silence exposed them. Vanessa looked toward Neil. "How much do you actually know?" Neil answered honestly. "Enough to ask questions. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight." Her eyes narrowed. "You've been spying on us." "No," Neil said calmly. "I've been paying attention." The distinction mattered to him. Vanessa called observation spying because it made her feel less responsible for what had been observed. Ethan suddenly stepped away from the table. "I'm done with this." Neil looked at him. "No, you're uncomfortable with this." Ethan turned sharply. "You think you can intimidate me because you've got some corporate title." Neil did not move. The younger man's voice had become louder now. "Faster!" The polished executive tone was disappearing. "Interesting. Because pressure did not create character. It revealed structure." Neil folded the edge of the folder closed. "This stopped being about titles when you sat at the head of my table." Vanessa exhaled sharply. "Oh my God, can you stop saying that? Like we committed murder." Neil looked at her. "No one's discussing morality." That confused her again, because Vanessa expected emotional language, pain, betrayal, marriage, loyalty. Instead, Neil kept speaking in terms of decisions, consequences, and records, and those things were harder to argue against. Claire finally stood from her chair. "I think maybe everyone needs air." Nobody followed her. She stayed standing awkwardly beside the table instead. The room had become too unstable to leave cleanly. Vanessa turned back toward Ethan. "Were you with this woman in Chicago number 2 fast again?" Neil almost sighed. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. "What?" he snapped. Neil looked at him quietly. "You answer denials before details. That doesn't mean anything." "It usually does." Ethan laughed once. "Short, sharp. You really sit around analyzing people like this?" "No," Neil replied. "Usually they're less obvious." Doug Harper stared hard at the table, trying not to react. Melissa Harper looked deeply uncomfortable now, not shocked anymore, embarrassed on behalf of everyone involved. Vanessa pointed toward the folder. "What exactly is in there?" Neil hesitated briefly, not because he feared showing it, because once certain information entered the room, it would stay there permanently. Then again, Vanessa had already made permanence impossible tonight. Neil opened the folder again and removed another document, a reimbursement summary page. Most financial figures blacked out. Dates visible, locations visible, hotel category visible. He slid it slowly toward the center of the table. "Public enough to discuss," he said. Vanessa leaned closer. "Chicago Marriott downtown, magnificent mile vendor relations. Weekend 2-room reservation adjustment, upgrade authorization, pending review." Vanessa frowned immediately. "2 rooms," Ethan answered quickly. "One got canceled." Neil spoke without raising his voice. After midnight, Ethan's face changed. Tiny movement, but enough. Vanessa looked at him sharply. How does he know that Neil answered before Ethan could? because the timestamp triggered a reimbursement flag. The room stayed silent. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Neil remembered the exact moment the Chicago report caught his attention weeks earlier. Not the expense amount, not the hotel, the timing. One room canceled at 12:43 a.m., the second upgraded 21 minutes later. People cheating expense systems often became sloppy around midnight. Alcohol, confidence, fatigue. Human beings rarely hid patterns as well as they believed. Vanessa's voice grew quieter. You said you spent the weekend in conference meetings. I did. With her, no. Again, too fast. Neil leaned back slightly. You keep answering before she finishes asking. Ethan slammed one hand lightly against the table. Because this is insane. Neil noticed Claire flinch. Vanessa didn't. She was staring only at Ethan now. What happened in Chicago? Ethan pointed toward Neil. He's twisting corporate paperwork into something personal. Neil shook his head once. No, you made corporate paperwork personal. Another silence. Ethan realized it too late. He had underestimated the one thing Neil valued most: documentation. Not emotion, not appearances, records, receipts, timelines, verifiable structure. Vanessa crossed both arms tightly now. Was Marissa Grant in your hotel room? Ethan looked trapped. No. Neil watched his eyes move left before answering. Memory access direction. Another old investigative habit. People often look toward remembered images before constructing denial. Ethan caught Neil noticing. That made him angrier. You think you're some kind of detective now? No, Neil replied calmly. Just detail-oriented. Doug Harper muttered quietly to Melissa. This guy's finished. Ethan heard it. His face darkened instantly. Vanessa heard it too. And suddenly the social side of this disaster became real to her. Not just betrayal. Witnesses. People talking afterward. Neighbors. Friends. Donor circles. The carefully polished image of her life beginning to crack in real time. Neil could see panic starting behind her eyes now. Not heartbreak. Exposure. She pointed at Neil suddenly. You waited for this. Neil answered honestly. Yes. The room froze again. Vanessa blinked. What? I waited until I had facts. You should have confronted me. With what? My marriage. Neil studied her quietly. You already decided what the marriage was months ago. That hit harder than shouting would have, because he sounded tired instead of angry. Tired carried truth differently. Ethan grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. I'm leaving. Neil nodded once. That's your choice. Vanessa turned sharply. You can't leave. Ethan stared at her. Interesting. For the first time all evening, irritation outweighed attraction in his expression. Neil noticed immediately. Pressure changed alliances fast. Vanessa stepped toward him. Don't walk out now. I'm not staying here while he interrogates me. Neil looked at him calmly. No one forced you to sit at the head of the table. Ethan's jaw tightened again. Vanessa turned toward Neil. Why are you enjoying this? Neil genuinely considered the question, then answered truthfully. I'm not. That unsettled the room more than cruelty would have, because everybody believed him. Neil did not look triumphant. He looked exhausted, like a man balancing numbers after flood damage. Claire finally spoke again. Vanessa, did you know Ethan was under review? Vanessa shook her head slowly. No. Claire turned toward Ethan. You never told her Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. It wasn't serious. Neil looked at him steadily. You don't know that yet. Ethan laughed bitterly. You'd love that, wouldn't you? Neil paused. No. That answer confused Ethan visibly. Neil continued. I would have preferred never knowing your name outside a spreadsheet. Silence. Pure silence. Because underneath everything else, that sentence carried something nobody expected from Neil tonight. Indifference, not jealousy, not obsession, just disappointment that his private life had collided with someone from an active audit file. Vanessa looked shaken by that more than anything else, because she wanted emotional devastation, not calm distance. She wanted proof she still controlled the emotional center of the room, but Neil kept refusing to give it to her. The rain softened slightly outside. Water still slid down the windows in thin streams. Ethan slowly lowered himself back into the chair instead of leaving. Neil noticed immediately. Fear had beaten pride. Good. People stayed seated when they believed standing might make things worse. Vanessa looked between both men. "What exactly happens Monday?" Neil answered carefully. A compliance interview. For what Neil looked at Ethan first, again giving him the opportunity. Again, Ethan stayed silent. So Neil answered. Expense irregularities, vendor relationship review, reporting discrepancies. Vanessa stared at Ethan. "You told me your numbers were amazing." "They are." Neil nodded once. "They were." Ethan looked at him sharply. That one word landed exactly where Neil intended. Were, past tense, potentially temporary. Ethan understood. Claire understood. Doug Harper definitely understood. Vanessa was beginning to. Neil closed the folder again carefully. Then he asked the question that finally changed the entire room. "Vanessa, when Ethan told you he was in Minneapolis that weekend," he paused. Ethan's face drained completely. Neil finished quietly. "Did he also tell you why his company mileage logs place him 42 miles south of Chicago at 1:17 Sunday morning?" Nobody breathed, not even Ethan, because now they all understood the same thing at once. Neil had far more than suspicion, and Ethan no longer knew how much worse the next document might be. Nobody spoke after Neil mentioned the mileage logs. The silence turned physical, heavy, the kind that settled into people's shoulders and made breathing feel louder than it should. Rain continued sliding across the windows while the dining room sat frozen beneath dim candlelight and untouched plates. Vanessa stared at Ethan. 42 miles south of Chicago, she repeated slowly. Ethan's face had gone pale enough now that even Jenna Carlisle stopped pretending not to notice. That doesn't mean anything, Ethan said, but the sentence arrived weaker than his earlier denials. Neil watched the younger man carefully. Fear had moved past concealment now. Ethan was trying to contain damage instead. Different instinct, different rhythm. Vanessa took one slow step backward from him. What was 42 miles south of Chicago? Ethan looked toward Neil first before answering. Mistake. Again. Neil noticed Claire catch it too. Answer her, Claire said quietly. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. It was a vendor dinner outside the city. Neil spoke calmly. At 1:17 in the morning, Ethan snapped toward him. You tracking company mileage isn't the same thing as proof. No, Neil agreed. It's pattern confirmation. That phrase landed badly, because Ethan knew exactly what pattern confirmation meant inside compliance review. Doug Harper let out a low whistle under his breath. Vanessa folded both arms tightly now. You lied to me. Ethan immediately turned defensive. You lied to your husband too. Wrong answer. Neil saw the shift instantly. Vanessa's expression hardened, not because Ethan was morally wrong, because he had just grouped her together with him. Shared guilt destroys romantic fantasy quickly. No, Vanessa said sharply. Don't do that. Do what? Don't make this sound equal. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Neil almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because now Ethan was learning something Neil had understood for years. Vanessa loved narratives more than people. And narratives required heroes and villains. She had planned tonight assuming Ethan would remain the polished rescuer, while Neil played the emotionally neglected husband. But now Ethan looked compromised, messy, uncertain, and Vanessa hated messy. Claire slowly sat back down. Nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. Not after this. The dinner had transformed into something darker now, less affair, more collapse. Neil noticed Melissa Harper quietly texting someone beneath the table, probably arranging an excuse for later. People always wanted distance from public implosions after witnessing them up close. Ethan pointed suddenly toward the folder again. You're weaponizing company information because you're bitter. Neil looked at him steadily. If I were weaponizing it, HR would already be here. That's a threat. No, Neil replied. That's perspective. Ethan laughed bitterly. You think you're untouchable because you sit behind compliance paperwork. Neil remained calm. No one in compliance is untouchable. Then stop acting superior. Superior. Interesting choice of word. Neil thought about it for a moment before answering. This was never about superiority. Really? Yes. Neil leaned back slightly. This is about decisions. Vanessa scoffed. You always talk like a machine. Neil looked at her. And you always confuse calm with weakness. That landed harder than he intended. Vanessa's face tightened instantly. For years she had mistaken Neil's restraint for passivity, his silence for inability, his patience for dependence. Neil understood why. Quiet men became invisible in loud environments, especially beside people like Vanessa. But invisible did not mean powerless. Doug Harper cleared his throat carefully. So what exactly happens now? Nobody answered immediately. The question felt too large for the room. Neil finally spoke. Personally, that depends on choices. And professionally, Doug asked. Neil looked toward Ethan. That depends on documentation. Ethan gave a short laugh without humor. You really get off on saying words like documentation. No, Neil said quietly. I get tired of people pretending records don't matter. That sentence silenced the room again. Because everyone there suddenly understood something uncomfortable. Neil had probably been watching patterns long before tonight. Not obsessively, methodically. Vanessa looked at him differently now, not lovingly, not fearfully exactly, but carefully, like someone realizing a quiet appliance in the corner had actually been controlling the entire electrical system the whole time. You investigated me, she said softly. Neil shook his head once. No. Then how did you know you stopped hiding? That hurt her more than accusation. Neil saw it clearly, because deep down Vanessa had believed she was sophisticated, careful, above ordinary mistakes. But the truth was simpler. People distracted by appearances usually overlooked details. Neil did not. Ethan suddenly grabbed his jacket again. I'm done. This time his voice carried anger instead of panic. Neil nodded. You can leave whenever you want. Vanessa turned sharply toward him. You're seriously walking out. Ethan stared back at her. What exactly do you expect me to do? Sit here while your husband audits my life. Neil corrected him calmly. Your reimbursements were already under review before I knew you were sleeping with my wife. Silence. Pure silence. Vanessa looked at Ethan slowly. You never told me that. Ethan exhaled sharply. Because it wasn't serious. Neil spoke before Vanessa could. You don't know that yet. Ethan slammed his hand lightly against the back of the chair. There you go again. Neil watched him carefully. Anger was finally overpowering discipline. Good. People revealed themselves fastest once emotional exhaustion arrived. Claire spoke softly. Ethan, were you using company money during all this? No, too immediate. Again. Neil almost admired the consistency. Vanessa noticed now, too. You answer way too fast. Ethan looked trapped for half a second, then angry. This is insane. Everybody's acting like I committed fraud over a hotel room. Neil tilted his head slightly. I haven't mentioned fraud. Ethan froze. The mistake registered instantly across his face. Doug Harper muttered quietly, Jesus, because now everybody understood the same thing simultaneously. Fraud was already on Ethan's mind. Vanessa stared at him. Why would you say fraud? Ethan rubbed his forehead hard, because that's clearly where he's trying to lead this. Neil remained perfectly still. No, he said quietly, that's where your paperwork led audit review. The room went dead silent again. Rainwater dripped rhythmically from the gutters outside. Neil could hear the furnace kick on downstairs once more, ordinary sounds surrounding extraordinary damage. Vanessa looked suddenly smaller, standing beside the table. Not weak, just lost. The script was completely gone now. No applause, no liberated romance, no dramatic emotional victory. Just paperwork lies and people staring at unfinished salmon. Claire finally looked directly at Neil. "How long have you known about them?" Neil thought for a moment. "Long enough. That's not an answer. It's the honest one." Vanessa shook her head slowly. "You just sat there for months." Neil met her eyes. "I waited until emotion stopped being useful." Nobody spoke after that, because the sentence carried something unsettlingly true. Neil remembered sitting alone in the study 3 months earlier after Vanessa came home smelling faintly of expensive cologne she claimed belonged to the fundraiser venue. He remembered looking at their wedding photo afterward and realizing anger would solve nothing immediately. Anger scattered evidence. Calm preserved it. Rebecca Shaw had told him that during their first consultation downtown near the Milwaukee River, never interrupt someone while they're building their own pattern. Neil had listened. Now Ethan looked toward the front hallway again, calculating escape. Neil noticed. So did Vanessa. And suddenly fear entered her face fully for the first time tonight, because she realized Ethan might protect himself before protecting her. Relationships built in secrecy often collapsed under exposure. Fast. "You said this was simple," Vanessa whispered to Ethan. Ethan stared back at her with visible frustration. "It was supposed to be." Neil heard that sentence clearly. So did everyone else. Supposed to be. Meaning simple affair, weak husband, controlled narrative, easy exit. Instead, they had walked into documentation timelines and unresolved audit review. Ethan suddenly looked at Neil with open hostility now. "You planned this whole thing." Neil shook his head slowly. "No. Bullshit. You invited yourself into my house," Neil said calmly. "I just stopped pretending not to notice." That ended whatever remained of Ethan's composure. "You know what," Ethan snapped. "Fine. You want honesty?" Vanessa turned toward him immediately. Neil stayed still, very still, because now Ethan looked like a man about to say something reckless. And reckless people often accelerated consequences faster than any investigation could. "You want honesty?" Ethan's voice cut sharply across the dining room. Rain hammered the windows harder, now wind pushing water sideways against the glass. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled low across the Milwaukee suburbs. Nobody moved. Vanessa stared at Ethan with widening eyes. Neil remained seated, still calm, still watching, because angry people usually believed volume gave them control back. Neil had learned years earlier that volume mostly revealed desperation. Ethan pointed directly at him. "You act like some patient saint sitting there with paperwork and quiet little comments." He laughed bitterly. "You know what Vanessa told me about you?" Vanessa's expression changed instantly. "Ethan." "No," Ethan snapped. "You wanted honesty." Neil watched the younger man carefully now. This was no longer corporate panic. This was ego collapse. Different thing entirely. "You know what she said?" Ethan continued. "She said you barely talked to her anymore, that you spent every night buried in spreadsheets or locked in that office, that she felt invisible in this house." Vanessa looked horrified, not because the statements were false, because Ethan was saying them publicly. Neil listened without interruption. Ethan laughed again. "And honestly, when I first met him, I believed her." Neil folded his hands quietly together. The younger man paced once near the end of the table, now unable to stay still anymore. "That's the funny part," Ethan said. "You don't look dangerous, you look tired." Neil almost smiled at that. Fair observation. He was tired. Tired of hidden phone screens. Tired of hearing Vanessa laugh differently into another room. tired of pretending not to recognize emotional distance because the mortgage still got paid and the lawn still got cut every Saturday morning. But exhaustion and weakness were not the same thing. Vanessa stepped toward Ethan. "Stop talking. You wanted this dinner. Not like this." Ethan laughed sharply. "Well, this is how it turned out." Neil watched the exchange quietly. Relationships built on performance often collapsed once audiences stopped cooperating. Vanessa turned toward Neil suddenly. "Say something." He looked at her calmly. "What would you like me to say? That none of this is true?" Neil considered that, then answered honestly, "Parts of it are." That hit harder than denial would have. Vanessa stared at him, because for the first time that night Neil acknowledged something painful openly. Not the affair, the distance before it. Claire lowered her eyes toward the table again. Doug Harper shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Nobody wanted emotional honesty anymore now that it had arrived. Ethan pointed toward Neil again. He checked out years ago. Neil finally stood, slowly, not aggressively, just enough to change the angle of the room. At 6'2", Neil rarely needed volume. Presence handled most situations more effectively. The dining room became quieter immediately. Neil looked directly at Ethan. "You're confusing restraint with absence." Ethan scoffed. "Oh, please." Neil continued calmly. "You think because someone doesn't perform emotion publicly, they don't feel anything privately." Silence. Even Vanessa stopped moving. Neil rarely spoke this much at once. Everyone there understood that instinctively. "When my father died," Neil said quietly, "I handled the funeral arrangements, probate paperwork, and my mother's mortgage refinance in 4 days. The room stayed still. I didn't cry in public. That didn't mean I wasn't grieving." Ethan said nothing. "When Emily broke her wrist at 14 during basketball season, I slept in a hospital chair for 2 nights, while Vanessa flew to a donor conference in Boston." Vanessa's face tightened immediately. "That's not fair." Neil looked at her. "It's accurate." Another silence. Rainwater slid down the windows in thick streaks now. The candles flickered under a draft, moving through the house. Neil continued, "You both mistook quiet for weakness." Nobody answered, because nobody could. Neil had not raised his voice once all evening, yet somehow he now controlled the room more completely than Vanessa ever had. Ethan folded his arms defensively. "So what? You're perfect now." Neil almost laughed at that. "No, then stop acting superior." Neil shook his head once. This was never about superiority. "Then what's your problem?" Neil looked directly at him. "You entered an active compliance review while hiding personal relationships connected to the reporting chain." Ethan threw up both hands. "There you go again with compliance." "Yes," Neil replied calmly, "because compliance exists whether people respect it or not." Doug Harper quietly muttered, "He's got a point." Ethan turned sharply. "Oh, come on." Doug lifted both hands immediately. "I'm just saying corporate review stuff gets ugly fast." Neil noticed Ethan hearing that carefully. Good. Fear worked better when it came from neutral people. Vanessa suddenly looked exhausted, not dramatic, actually exhausted. Her makeup had begun fading slightly near the corners of her eyes. One strand of hair had fallen loose near her cheek. The polished image she maintained so carefully was unraveling piece by piece. "When did you know?" she asked Neil softly. Neil looked at her. "About Ethan?" She nodded. "Late spring." Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You knew for months, I suspected first, and you said nothing." Neil thought briefly, then answered. "Angry accusations without evidence become arguments. Evidence becomes decisions." Claire closed her eyes briefly after hearing that, because it sounded exactly like Neil. Practical, cold on the surface, quietly devastating underneath. Vanessa laughed weakly. "So you investigated your own wife?" "No." "Then what did you do?" Neil looked at the dining room around him, the expensive wine, the untouched plates, the carefully arranged candles, then back at Vanessa. I paid attention to patterns. That sentence lingered heavily. Neil remembered all of them now, the charity meetings ending after midnight, the sudden password changes, the unexplained cash withdrawals, the way Vanessa began turning her phone face down during dinner 6 months earlier. Not one thing. Patterns. Rebecca Shaw had explained it clearly during their second meeting downtown. Infidelity cases rarely collapse from secrets. They collapse from repeated carelessness. Neil had listened, very carefully. Ethan sat back down heavily into his chair now. His anger was burning out, replaced by fatigue and calculation again. Dangerous combination. Neil recognized it from disciplinary interviews. This was usually the point people started deciding who to sacrifice. Vanessa noticed it too, and fear returned to her face immediately. "Ethan," she said quietly, "tell me the truth." He rubbed one hand over his forehead. "What truth? About Chicago?" Neil remained silent intentionally. Letting them speak now gave cleaner information than confrontation. Ethan exhaled hard. Marissa was there for vendor relations. Vanessa waited, and nothing happened. Neil watched Ethan carefully. Again, direct eye contact before denial. Slight pause afterward, jaw tension. Not clean. Vanessa noticed now too. "You're lying." "I'm not. You lied about Minneapolis. That was different." How Ethan looked trapped again. Claire whispered softly, "Jesus." Neil could almost see the entire relationship collapsing in real time now. Not because of morality, because trust between dishonest people depended entirely on mutual illusion. Once doubt entered, everything rotted fast. Vanessa turned suddenly toward Neil. "You already knew all this," Neil answered carefully. "I knew enough to prepare." That word changed the room again. Prepare, not react. Prepare. Doug Harper frowned slightly. "What exactly did you prepare?" Neil looked at him, then toward the hallway leading to the front door. Beyond it sat his old Ford truck in the rain-dark driveway. Inside the truck was another binder, not corporate, personal, bank records, asset protection filings, property documentation, attorney correspondence. Neil had spent 3 months quietly building structure underneath the collapse he knew was coming. Because panic ruined leverage. Preparation created options. Vanessa noticed the shift in his expression immediately. Her voice became smaller. "What did you do, Neil?" He looked back at her. "Exactly what you should do before someone publicly announces they've been lying to you." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Neil answered calmly. "It means I didn't walk into tonight unprepared." Silence again, heavy now, the kind that pressed against the ribs. Vanessa stared at him with something close to fear for the first time all evening. Because suddenly she realized the dinner announcement had not blindsided Neil at all. And if Neil had prepared, then maybe tonight was only the beginning of consequences she had not yet imagined. Neil glanced once toward the front hallway, then back at the table. "I need to grab something from the truck," he said quietly. Nobody stopped him, but Ethan's face lost color immediately, because whatever was in that truck, he knew it would be worse than the folder already sitting on the table. Neil stepped away from the dining room without hurrying. Behind him, nobody spoke immediately. The silence followed him through the hallway like pressure moving through pipes. He grabbed his coat from the rack near the front door and stepped outside into the cold October rain. Water hit his shoulders instantly. Sharp, heavy, real. For a moment, the cold air felt better than the warmth inside the house. Inside had become theater collapsing under fluorescent truth. Outside was simpler. Rain, wind, wet pavement. Neil walked down the driveway toward the old gray Ford F-150 parked beneath the maple tree he planted more than a decade earlier. The porch light reflected across rainwater pooling on the hood. He unlocked the truck and reached behind the passenger seat. The second binder sat exactly where he left it. Black leather, no company logo, no compliance tabs. Personal, much more dangerous. Neil rested one hand on it for a second before lifting it carefully. Not because he doubted himself, because this binder marked the real ending. The folder inside the dining room threatened Ethan's career. This one threatened the life Vanessa believed she still controlled. Neil closed the truck door slowly and stood in the rain another moment. He remembered the first night he met Rebecca Shaw 3 months earlier, downtown Milwaukee, third-floor office overlooking the Riverwalk. Rebecca had worn a charcoal suit and read through Neil's notes without interrupting once. When he finished, she asked only one question: "Do you want revenge or do you want protection?" Neil answered immediately, "Protection." She nodded once. "Good. Revenge makes people sloppy." Then she spent 2 hours helping him build structure quietly beneath the marriage, while Vanessa still believed she controlled the timeline. Emergency account separation, property review, retirement documentation, digital financial tracking, mortgage protections, everything calm, everything legal, everything recorded. Neil walked back toward the house holding the binder beneath his coat. Rainwater dripped from his sleeves onto the hardwood floor when he stepped inside. Every face in the dining room turned toward him immediately. Ethan looked first at the binder. Vanessa looked at Neil. That difference mattered. Neil removed his coat slowly and hung it back on the rack before returning to the table. Nobody spoke until he sat down. The black binder rested beside his plate now. Vanessa stared at it. "What is that?" Neil answered quietly. "Personal records." Ethan's face tightened immediately. Good instinct. He understood danger when he saw organized paperwork. Vanessa crossed her arms. "You've been planning this." Neil looked at her. "No. Then what do you call that? Preparation." The word hit differently this time, because now everyone understood it extended beyond corporate review. Doug Harper finally stood. "I really think Melissa and I should please stay," Vanessa interrupted quickly. Too quickly. Neil understood why immediately. Witnesses still mattered to her. People like Vanessa feared private collapse more than public humiliation. If everyone left now, she would have to face reality without audience management. Doug slowly sat back down again, deeply uncomfortable. Neil opened the binder carefully. Inside sat neatly organized tabs: property accounts, legal insurance transfers. Vanessa's face changed instantly when she saw the labels. Not anger anymore. Alarm. "What is this?" Neil removed a sealed envelope first and placed it gently beside her wine glass. The name Rebecca Shaw, attorney at law, appeared across the upper corner. Vanessa stared at it without touching it. "You hired a lawyer?" "Yes, when July." The room went silent again. Vanessa looked genuinely shaken now, not socially embarrassed, personally shaken, because July meant Neil had already known months before tonight. "You talked to a divorce lawyer for months without telling me." Neil met her eyes. "You announced your relationship at dinner without telling me." Vanessa looked away first. That mattered too. Claire slowly exhaled. "Oh, Vanessa." Vanessa ignored her sister completely. Her attention stayed locked on the binder. "What exactly is in there?" Neil answered calmly. "Documentation," Ethan muttered quietly. "Of course it is." Neil ignored him. He opened the property section first. Mortgage statements, deed records, refinance documentation. Vanessa stared at the pages. "You went through all our accounts." "No," Neil corrected softly. "I reviewed the ones attached to my name." "That's insane." "No," Neil said. "It's necessary." The difference between them had always lived inside words like that. Vanessa reacted emotionally first and structurally second. Neil reacted structurally first because emotions changed nothing unless systems moved with them. Neil slid another document toward her. Joint equity withdrawal summaries, highlighted entries. Vanessa's breathing changed immediately, not because the numbers were enormous, because they existed, trackable, visible. "You tracked my spending." "I tracked unexplained movement from joint accounts." Claire looked toward Vanessa slowly. "What movement?" Vanessa answered sharply before Neil could. "Normal spending." Neil remained calm. $24,000 transferred across 4 months into an external account isn't normal spending, Doug Harper muttered under his breath again. Melissa closed her eyes briefly. Ethan suddenly looked irritated instead of frightened. Interesting. Neil watched the shift carefully. Ethan was distancing himself emotionally now. Survival instinct. He had begun calculating individually instead of collectively. Vanessa noticed too late. "You said you were financially independent," Ethan said suddenly. Vanessa turned toward him in disbelief. "What, you told me you handled your own money?" Neil almost pitied her, almost, because now the affair had entered the stage where both participants began re-evaluating the value of each other. Fantasy collapsed quickly once legal and financial reality appeared. Vanessa looked back at Neil. "You're trying to ruin my life." Neil answered honestly, "No, I'm protecting mine." The sentence settled heavily into the room. Outside, thunder rolled again farther away now. Rain softened slightly against the windows. Neil opened another section of the binder. Insurance records, beneficiary updates, emergency contact changes. Vanessa stared harder. "You changed everything, yeah." When, gradually. The word terrified her. Neil saw it clearly, because gradual meant thoughtful, not emotional reaction, planned separation, quiet withdrawal. Vanessa shook her head slowly. "You were just pretending all this time." "No," Neil replied. "I was waiting until preparation mattered more than confrontation." Ethan leaned back in his chair, now arms folded tightly. The younger man no longer looked like Vanessa's confident new beginning. He looked trapped inside someone else's legal meeting. Claire spoke softly. "Neil, were you going to tell her yes?" When Neil thought for a moment, after the paperwork was complete, Vanessa laughed weakly. "So what? You were going to blindside me." Neil looked directly at her. "You invited your boyfriend to a dinner announcement." That ended the argument instantly, because no one in the room could pretend moral balance existed anymore. Vanessa's eyes drifted back toward the binder again. Fear deepened there, not because of money itself, because she realized Neil had already separated emotionally in ways she never noticed. The quiet husband she underestimated had spent months rebuilding his life underneath her assumptions. Ethan suddenly stood again. "This has gone way too far." Neil looked at him calmly. "You're free to leave." Ethan pointed toward the binder. "This has nothing to do with me anymore." Interesting sentence. Not us, not Vanessa. Me. Individual separation complete. Vanessa heard it too. Her expression hardened instantly. "You're seriously backing away now?" Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "What do you expect me to do? Stand beside me?" Neil watched the exchange silently. Rebecca had predicted this almost exactly. When pressure arrives, relationships built through secrecy often collapse into self-preservation. Nobody wants shared consequences once consequences become real. Vanessa stared at Ethan. "You told me we were building something real." Ethan laughed bitterly. "We were supposed to leave before it got like this." There it was. Supposed to. Planned escape, planned narrative, planned transition. Neil noticed Claire looking physically sick now. Doug Harper stared at the table like he wanted the floor to open. Melissa whispered, "Oh my God," for perhaps the 5th time that night. Neil closed the binder carefully. Then he slid one final document toward Vanessa. Temporary filing preparation papers. Unsigned, but complete. Vanessa's face drained of color completely this time. "You already prepared divorce filings?" Neil nodded once. "Yes." The room went utterly silent. Not tense anymore, just stunned. Because everyone finally understood the same thing. Neil Hamilton had not spent months surviving betrayal. He had spent months preparing for the moment betrayal finally revealed itself publicly. And Vanessa had walked directly into a situation where the quietest person in the room already knew exactly what came next. Monday morning arrived gray and cold over Milwaukee. The rain from Saturday night had passed, but heavy clouds still hung low above the city as commuters filled Interstate 94 with slow-moving headlights. Neil parked his Ford truck in the employee garage beneath Great Lakes Med Supply headquarters at 7:12 a.m. The building rose 8 stories above West National Avenue. Glass exterior, steel framing, corporate minimalism designed to look efficient instead of welcoming. Neil sat inside the truck for a moment before shutting off the engine. Quiet. No candles, no wine glasses, no emotional speeches, just procedure now. He preferred procedure. Inside the leather messenger bag beside him sat 2 folders, the active compliance review file and notes prepared over the weekend for legal. Neil stepped out into the cold morning air and entered the building through the employee access doors. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. People nodded politely as he passed. Morning, Neil. Morning. Hey, Hamilton. Routine voices, routine Monday. No one here knew about Saturday night, at least not yet. Neil took the elevator to the 6th floor where compliance and legal shared conference space overlooking the parking structure. At 8:03 a.m., he entered conference room C. Glass walls, long walnut table, 2 screens mounted on the far wall. Already waiting inside Lydia Park from internal audit, Martin Feld from legal, and Angela Ruiz from HR compliance. 3 laptops open, 3 printed folders, 3 paper cups of bad coffee. Normal. Neil appreciated normal after Saturday. Angela looked up first. You okay? Neil nodded once. Yes. She studied him carefully, not because she suspected personal drama, because people in compliance learn to recognize exhaustion quickly. Long weekend, she asked. Something like that. Martin slid a document across the table. Brooks' interview structure. Neil reviewed it silently. Standard procedure, reimbursement review, vendor disclosure, questions, mileage discrepancies, hospitality approvals, reporting conflict review. Clean, controlled, nothing emotional. That mattered, because Neil had already informed legal early Sunday morning about the personal overlap involving Vanessa. Everything documented, everything disclosed. No secrets. Martin had handled it professionally. We appreciate you flagging the conflict immediately, he said quietly. Neil nodded. Necessary. Martin studied him briefly. You still comfortable participating? Yes, if that changes, say so. Neil appreciated that too. Systems mattered because good systems protected process from emotion. That was the difference between anger and structure. At 9:24 a.m., the conference room door opened. Ethan Brooks entered wearing a charcoal suit and a dark blue tie. He looked terrible, not physically damaged, worse, unstable. Lack of sleep showed around his eyes. His jaw looked tighter than usual. The confidence from Saturday night had thinned into something brittle. Neil noticed immediately that Ethan avoided direct eye contact for nearly 3 seconds after entering. Fear. Then came anger, then professionalism, predictable order. Angela gestured toward the chair opposite the table. Morning, Ethan. Morning. His voice sounded rough. He sat down slowly and placed a leather portfolio on the table. Neil noticed his hands first. Slight tremor, tiny but visible. Martin began calmly. This is a formal compliance review discussion regarding expense reporting and vendor disclosure concerns connected to North Central Division travel activity. Ethan nodded stiffly. Neil said nothing. That unsettled Ethan more than participation would have. People feared quiet observers in rooms like this. Angela continued, You are not currently under termination review. This is an information-gathering process. Important phrasing. Careful phrasing. Ethan relaxed slightly after hearing it. Too early. Lydia opened the first file. Let's begin with Chicago travel activity from August 17th through 19th. Ethan nodded again. Okay. Lydia projected reimbursement summaries onto the screen. Hotel records, mileage reports, vendor hospitality categories, all cleanly organized. No drama, no raised voices, just records. Neil watched Ethan realize something slowly. The system looked much more dangerous in daylight than it had in candlelight. Saturday night still allowed emotional arguments. Conference room C allowed only documentation. Lydia spoke calmly. Your reimbursement request included revised hotel accommodations at the Marriott Downtown Magnificent Mile. Yes. Can you explain the adjustment client scheduling changes? Which client? Multiple vendor representatives. Names. Ethan hesitated slightly. Marissa Grant, among others. Lydia typed notes without expression. Neil remained still. The room temperature felt colder than the dining room Saturday night, despite the heating vents running overhead. Martin asked the next question. Why did vehicle mileage place your assigned company car outside approved routing parameters at approximately 1:17 a.m. Sunday morning? Ethan exhaled once before answering. Client entertainment dinner extended later than expected. Martin nodded slightly. Location: South Suburban Hospitality Venue. Name: another hesitation. Neil watched it carefully, not because the answer itself mattered most, because hesitation always created openings for deeper review. Ethan finally answered. Harbor Point Steakhouse. Lydia typed again. Martin looked toward Neil briefly. Neil understood immediately. Harbor Point closed at 11 p.m. on Sundays, meaning the timeline still failed. Martin returned attention to Ethan. Our records indicate the venue closed before midnight. Ethan froze, only briefly, but enough. I may have the timing wrong. Martin folded his hands. Were you with Ms. Grant after the dinner concluded? There it was. Direct question. Clean, professional. Ethan shifted in his chair. Yes, no denial now. Interesting. Truth arrives faster once documentation closes exits. Angela asked calmly, was this relationship disclosed through vendor interaction reporting procedures? No. Why not? Ethan rubbed his forehead slowly. I didn't think it was relevant. Martin spoke evenly. Vendor representatives connected to active contract negotiation are always relevant. Ethan looked toward Neil then. Finally, directly. The anger from Saturday returned briefly. This is retaliation. Nobody reacted emotionally. Angela answered first. Mr. Hamilton disclosed the personal conflict voluntarily before this meeting. Ethan blinked. What? Martin slid a form across the table. Sunday morning disclosure record. Neil watched realization hit him hard because Ethan now understood something important. Neil had protected procedure before protecting pride. No hidden agenda. No secret ambush. Full disclosure. That destroyed retaliation arguments almost immediately. Ethan leaned back heavily in his chair. Unbelievable. Martin continued calmly. We're also reviewing reimbursement categorization connected to hospitality expenses exceeding approved vendor thresholds. Lydia projected another file. Bar receipts, duplicate mileage overlap, weekend adjustment approvals. Neil noticed Ethan's breathing changing again. Faster now, pressure building. Angela spoke carefully. Did you knowingly submit inaccurate reimbursement information? No. Did you knowingly omit personal involvement with a vendor representative during active contract review? Silence. Ethan looked exhausted suddenly, not defensive anymore. Defeated, yes. The admission settled heavily into the room. Lydia stopped typing briefly. Martin wrote something by hand. Neil remained motionless. No satisfaction, only confirmation, because this was the part people misunderstood about quiet preparation. Preparation did not create joy, it created inevitability. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. This got blown way out of proportion. Martin answered calmly. No, it followed process. That sentence stayed in the room for several seconds. Followed process. Neil almost thought about Saturday night again. Vanessa standing beside candlelight believing she controlled the narrative. Ethan sitting at the head of the table believing confidence could overpower structure. Neither understood process. Process was slow, quiet, patient, and once moving, very difficult to stop. Angela closed her folder. Pending final review. We are placing you on administrative suspension, effective immediately. Ethan looked up sharply. What? This is not termination, she clarified. Your access credentials and company vehicle privileges will be temporarily suspended during continued investigation. Ethan looked directly at Neil again. Pure resentment now. You happy, Neil? Met his eyes steadily. No, and he meant it. Because despite everything, this still felt ugly. Necessary, but ugly. Ethan laughed bitterly. You could have stopped this. Neil answered quietly. So could you. Silence. Martin slid final paperwork across the table. Security will coordinate access return procedures. Ethan stared at the papers without touching them. The polished sales manager from Saturday night was gone now. No charm, no speeches. Just a tired man sitting beneath fluorescent lights, realizing systems had already moved beyond him. Neil gathered his own folders calmly. The meeting was ending, but he already knew something else had begun, because once suspension records entered the corporate system, word traveled fast. And somewhere beyond this building, Vanessa still had no idea how quickly consequences spread once paperwork became official. By Wednesday morning, the rumors had already spread through Great Lakes Med Supply. Not openly. Companies like Great Lakes rarely gossiped in obvious ways. They operated through lowered voices near coffee stations, sudden pauses when elevators opened, and unusually careful emails. Administrative suspension traveled fast inside corporate systems, especially when sales numbers had once looked strong. Neil noticed it immediately. Conversations stopped slightly when he entered shared spaces. People avoided mentioning Ethan's territory during meetings. 2 managers canceled vendor dinners that week without explanation. Nobody said the word affair. Nobody needed to. Corporate environments translated scandal into softer language. Conflict concerns, disclosure issues, compliance review, temporary leave. Cleaner words, same damage. Neil kept working. That surprised some people. Maybe they expected visible triumph. Maybe they expected rage. Instead, he reviewed hospital supply chain reports. Tuesday morning approved staffing adjustments Wednesday afternoon and corrected inventory discrepancies in Madison before lunch on Thursday. Routine. Structure helped. Routine gave grief shape. At 6:40 Thursday evening, Neil sat alone in his office, reviewing vendor renewal summaries while the rest of the 6th floor slowly emptied. Outside the glass wall behind him, Milwaukee traffic crawled through wet streets beneath fading gray light. His phone buzzed once. Rebecca Shaw. Neil answered immediately. How bad Rebecca did not waste words. Vanessa's consulting board found out about Ethan's suspension. Neil leaned back slightly in his chair. How probably social overlap. Corporate spouses talk. Yes, they always did. Milwaukee looked large from the highway. In reality, executive circles were small enough to suffocate inside. Rebecca continued. One of her nonprofit clients requested clarification regarding possible vendor conflict exposure. Neil closed his eyes briefly, not because he felt satisfaction, because consequences had officially escaped containment now. Saturday night had stayed inside the house. This would not. They suspended her project access temporarily, Rebecca said. Neil looked out across the city lights. She called you. She called, screaming. That almost sounded familiar enough to be funny. Almost. What did you tell her? The same thing I told you 3 months ago. Rebecca paused. Documentation doesn't care about feelings. Neil breathed slowly once. Rain streaked across the office windows again. Wisconsin weather settling permanently into late autumn. You okay? Rebecca asked. Neil considered the question honestly. No. Good. That answer surprised him slightly. Rebecca continued calmly. If you felt fine during this, I'd worry about you. Neil almost smiled. She always sounded more like a structural engineer than a divorce attorney. Did she sign anything yet? He asked. No, but she's scared now, scared. Interesting word. Vanessa had not looked scared Saturday night. Excited, confident, performative. Fear arrived only after systems moved. Rebecca's voice lowered slightly. She also asked whether you're planning to force a sale of the house. Neil looked down at the paperwork spread across his desk. No. Good. I want stability for Emily. That's why you're going to come out of this cleaner than she is. Neil said nothing, because winning had never been the goal. Survival had. Protection had. Rebecca exhaled softly. One more thing. What Ethan Brooks, retained counsel. Neil looked toward the darkened conference rooms beyond the hallway. That was fast. He's worried about civil recovery exposure if the reimbursement review expands. Neil nodded slowly. Of course he was. Once companies suspected intentional expense manipulation, suspension often became the smallest problem in the room. Vendor contracts, audit trails, mileage reimbursement, hospitality approvals. Everything left footprints. Anything else? Neil asked. Yes. Rebecca paused briefly. Vanessa's waiting downstairs. Neil frowned slightly. At the office, in the lobby. He checked the clock. 6:47 p.m. She's been there almost 40 minutes. Neil remained silent. Rebecca spoke carefully now. You don't have to go down. But Neil already knew he would. Not because he wanted reconciliation, because unfinished conversations rotted. I'll handle it, he said quietly. Rebecca's voice softened slightly. Remember what matters. Documentation. No. Small pause. Your peace. The line disconnected. Neil sat still for several seconds afterward. Peace. Strange word. He wasn't sure he remembered what peace felt like anymore. Only control, only preparation, only surviving one structured day at a time. Neil gathered his papers neatly into stacks before shutting down the office lights. The sixth-floor hallway stood mostly empty now. Cleaning staff moved quietly near the elevators, pushing gray carts full of supplies. Normal evening, normal building. Strange how ordinary places continued functioning while lives quietly collapsed inside them. Neil rode the elevator down alone. The mirrored walls reflected a man who looked older than he remembered. Not broken, just worn down around the edges. The lobby lights glowed warm against polished marble floors. When the elevator doors opened, Vanessa sat near the far windows beside a decorative ficus tree. She stood immediately when she saw him. Neil noticed three things at once. First, she looked exhausted. Second, she had come alone. Third, she no longer looked angry. That worried him more than anger would have. Vanessa approached slowly. Her voice sounded smaller now. Can we talk? Neil nodded once toward the seating area. They sat across from each other in low, leather chairs while evening traffic moved outside the glass windows beyond them. For a moment, neither spoke. Neil let the silence settle naturally. Vanessa used to hate silence. Now she looked grateful for it. Finally, she asked quietly, Did you know they suspended Ethan? Yes. You didn't tell them about us. Neil looked at her steadily. No, then how did they find out? Because systems overlap. Vanessa laughed weakly once. Everything with you is systems. Neil thought about that, then answered honestly. Systems are what remain after emotions fail. She looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring still sat there. Neil noticed it immediately. Interesting. Vanessa spoke softly. My board suspended me from donor outreach this morning. Neil said nothing. They think I created liability exposure. Another silence. I didn't know any of this was happening with Ethan, she whispered. Neil believed that part, not because Vanessa was innocent, because she never paid attention to details unless details threatened appearances. She looked up slowly. Did he really cheat on me in Chicago? Neil answered carefully. I don't know. But you think so? Yes. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. For the first time all week, Neil saw something genuine cross her face. Not performance, humiliation, real humiliation. Not over morality, over being fooled herself. "That's the worst part," she whispered. "You know that." Neil remained still. "I thought I was the one making choices." Outside, headlights slid across rain-dark streets beyond the glass. Neil watched people moving through the city, carrying groceries, umbrellas, briefcases. Ordinary lives continuing. Vanessa looked back at him carefully. "You already emotionally left me months ago, didn't you?" Neil considered lying, then decided against it. Yes. The honesty hurt her visibly, more than anger would have. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because by the time I confirmed things, the marriage was already changing shape." Vanessa stared at him. "You talk about marriage like infrastructure." Neil almost smiled faintly. "That's because marriage is infrastructure." She looked confused. Neil continued quietly. "It's routines, trust, shared decisions, predictability, stability under pressure." The lobby remained quiet around them. Somewhere near reception, a printer hummed briefly. Vanessa shook her head slowly. "And when did ours collapse?" Neil answered immediately. "When honesty became strategy instead of instinct." That silenced her completely, because she knew exactly what he meant. The affair itself had not destroyed the marriage first. The performance had. The manipulation, the narratives, the public dinner, the careful humiliation setup. Vanessa looked suddenly close to tears. Neil noticed, but he felt strangely distant from it now, not cruel, just removed, like touching scar tissue after the wound already closed. She spoke again quietly. "Do you hate me?" Neil thought for a long moment, then answered truthfully, "No." That surprised her. "What then?" Neil looked toward the rain beyond the lobby windows. "Tired." The word settled heavily between them because it sounded older than anger. Vanessa wiped quickly beneath one eye. "I don't know what happens now." Neil looked back at her calmly. "Yes, you do." She stared at him, and for the first time since Saturday night, Vanessa Hamilton finally understood something completely. Neil had already accepted the end long before she announced it publicly, and once a quiet man truly accepted an ending, he rarely walked backward into noise again. The rain had stopped by the time Neil and Vanessa left the office lobby. Cold wind moved through downtown Milwaukee, instead pushing damp air between buildings and across the parking structure lights. Vanessa followed Neil outside without asking permission. He noticed. He said nothing. His truck sat beneath a flickering garage light near the far end of the lot. Water still glistened across the hood from earlier rain. Vanessa wrapped her coat tighter around herself. "Can we please not end this in a parking garage?" Neil unlocked the truck, but didn't open the door yet. It didn't end in a parking garage. She stared at him. It ended long before tonight. The sentence hit her visibly. Neil saw it settle behind her eyes slowly, because she knew he meant it. Not as punishment, as fact. Vanessa stepped closer. "I made mistakes." Neil nodded once. "Yes, that's it. What else would you like me to say?" She looked frustrated immediately. "There's no emotion with you anymore." Neil considered that carefully, then answered honestly. "There's less chaos." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "You really became impossible to reach." "No," Neil said quietly. "You stopped trying unless the conversation benefited you." That angered her instantly. "That's not fair." Neil looked at her steadily. "Isn't it?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because underneath the affair, underneath Ethan, underneath the public dinner announcement, there had always been a quieter truth neither of them liked discussing. Vanessa wanted admiration more than intimacy, and Neil had learned silence was easier than competing with performance. Wind pushed sharply through the parking structure again. A loose receipt skittered across wet concrete near the elevators. Vanessa rubbed her hands together for warmth. "Ethan manipulated me," she said finally. Neil remained still. "He made me feel important." Neil thought about the sentence for a moment. then answered carefully, "No." Vanessa frowned. "What?" He reflected back, "The version of yourself you already wanted to see." Silence. That hurt her more deeply than accusation, because it removed innocence without sounding cruel. Vanessa looked away toward the city lights. "You think I'm a terrible person?" "No." Then what? Neil breathed slowly once. "I think you confused attention with value." The words settled heavily between them. Cars moved distantly along the freeway beyond downtown, white headlights cutting through wet darkness. Vanessa's eyes filled slightly. "You used to love me." Neil looked at her quietly. "I did." The honesty shook her more than denial would have. She stepped closer again. "Then why does it feel like you stopped fighting for us years ago?" Neil rested one hand against the truck door. Because the answer mattered, and because he no longer saw value in avoiding truth. "Do you remember the dinner in Cedarburg 3 years ago?" he asked. Vanessa frowned slightly. "What dinner?" "The donor event at the yacht club." She looked confused. Neil continued, "You introduced me to a surgeon from Northwestern and said I worked somewhere in hospital shipping." Vanessa exhaled sharply. "Oh my God, Neil!" "You laughed after saying it. It was a joke." "No," Neil replied calmly. "It was a pattern." Silence again. Neil watched understanding slowly spread across her face. Not full understanding, but enough. "For years," he said quietly, "you kept reducing parts of me that didn't fit the image you wanted beside you. That's not true. You never asked what my promotion actually involved. You never talked about work. Because every time I did, you redirected the conversation toward appearances." Vanessa folded her arms tightly. "That's ridiculous." Neil shook his head once. "No. Ridiculous was finding out my wife introduced her boyfriend to donors before introducing him honestly to herself." That one landed hard. Vanessa looked genuinely wounded now. Good. Not because Neil wanted pain, because truth without discomfort usually changed nothing. She stared down at the wet concrete for several seconds, then finally whispered, "I didn't think you noticed things." Neil almost smiled at that, not happily, sadly. People notice more when they speak less. Wind moved through the garage again. Vanessa looked exhausted now in a way Neil had never seen before. Not glamorous exhaustion, not dramatic sadness, just stripped-down emotional fatigue. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Neil answered immediately. "Lawyers, that cold, that clean." She looked away again. "I never thought you'd actually leave." Neil considered that carefully. Interesting statement. Not "I never thought we'd end," but "I never thought you'd leave." Meaning she had expected permanence from him no matter what happened. Steady husband. Predictable husband, forgiving husband. Neil finally understood something important in that moment. Vanessa had never truly imagined consequences because she had never imagined Neil existing outside the role she assigned him. "You already left emotionally months ago," she said softly. "Yes." And Neil paused, then answered honestly. He accelerated timing. Vanessa laughed weakly through tears. "So I destroyed my marriage for someone who probably cheated on me too." Neil did not answer. He didn't need to. Vanessa looked at him carefully now. "You don't even sound angry anymore." Neil stared out toward the city lights beyond the parking structure. "I was angry in June." She blinked. "June, when I first confirmed enough patterns." What happened after that? Neil thought about Rebecca Shaw's office, the binders, the spreadsheets, the silent dinners, Emily calling from Madison asking whether everything felt weird at home lately. Then he answered quietly, "I got organized." Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. That's terrifying. Maybe it was. Neil understood why. Explosive men frightened people immediately. Quiet men frightened them later. Because quiet men often built structure before anyone realized a collapse had already begun. Vanessa looked toward him again. "Did you ever plan on humiliating me?" Neil answered instantly, "No." Then why did you let Saturday happen? The question mattered. Neil considered it carefully before responding. Because you needed witnesses more than honesty. She stared at him silently, and I wanted you to understand the difference. Another silence settled between them, not violent now. Not explosive, just final. Vanessa wiped beneath her eyes again. What do I tell Emily? Neil looked at her for a long moment. Our daughter is 19 years old, he said quietly. Tell her the truth before someone else tells her a version. Vanessa nodded weakly. That answer hurt because it was responsible. Neil opened the truck door finally. Vanessa stepped forward one last time. Neil. He looked at her. I really did love you once. The words hung in the cold air between them. Neil believed her. That was the tragedy of it. People rarely destroy marriages they completely hate. Usually they destroy the ones they slowly stop respecting. Neil nodded once. I know. Vanessa looked like she expected something more after that. Forgiveness, maybe. Comfort. Permission to feel less guilty. Neil offered none of it, not cruelly, simply because those things no longer belonged to him. She finally stepped backward. The parking garage lights hummed softly overhead. Water dripped steadily somewhere deeper inside the structure. Vanessa's voice sounded very small now. I don't know who you are anymore. Neil looked at her steadily. No, he said quietly. You just never paid attention. The sentence ended everything, not legally, not officially, but emotionally. Vanessa stood motionless beside the wet concrete while Neil climbed into the truck. He closed the door gently. No dramatic exit, no final speech, just silence. As the engine started, Neil looked once through the windshield at the woman standing alone beneath fluorescent parking lights. Then he drove slowly out into the cold Milwaukee night, and for the first time in years, the quiet inside him no longer felt empty. It felt clean. By February, the house finally sounded different, quieter, not empty, just honest. Snow covered the Brookfield neighborhood in thick white layers, softening driveways and rooftops beneath pale Wisconsin sunlight. The maple trees in Neil's front yard stood bare and still, while salt trucks moved slowly through the subdivision before dawn. Inside the Hamilton house, the dining room no longer looked like a showroom. Neil had changed that first, not dramatically, carefully. The gold-trimmed plates were boxed away in the basement, beside decorations Vanessa once insisted made the house look elevated. The oversized candle centerpiece disappeared. So did the artificial orchids and decorative marble trays nobody was allowed to touch. Neil repainted the walls himself over 3 weekends in January. Warm gray, simple, clean. He replaced the dining room chandelier too, not because the old one was expensive, because Vanessa picked it based on photographs instead of light. The new fixture cast softer light across the table. Useful light, real light. The divorce finalized 12 days earlier. No courtroom drama, no screaming, just signatures, asset division, and structured agreements drafted through attorneys. Rebecca Shaw called it a clean dissolution under ugly circumstances. Neil appreciated the wording. Vanessa moved into a condo outside Madison near one of her former nonprofit contacts. Temporary consulting work. Smaller circles now, quieter circles. Neil heard pieces indirectly through Claire, not gossip, just updates. Claire had apologized twice since the parking garage conversation downtown. Once by phone, once over coffee at a small cafe near Wauwatosa. Neil accepted the apology both times. Because Claire had not caused the collapse, she simply watched it happen too long. Ethan Brooks officially resigned before termination proceedings completed. Legal classified the departure as voluntary separation during pending compliance escalation. Corporate language again, still ugly underneath. Civil recovery negotiations remained active regarding flagged reimbursements and vendor hospitality expenses. Neil never asked for details. He didn't want them anymore. By then, Ethan had become exactly what he always should have remained, a closed file. On Friday evening, light snow drifted quietly outside while Neil stood alone in the kitchen preparing dinner. Nothing elaborate: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with garlic, fresh bread from a bakery in Elm Grove. Simple food, the kind people actually ate instead of photographed. Music played softly from the speaker near the sink. Not jazz this time, old acoustic rock from Neil's college years. The house smelled warm again, lived in again. Neil checked the oven timer and glanced toward the dining room. The table sat already set for 4 people. Emily arrived first, just after 6. She burst through the front door carrying cold air and snowflakes on her coat sleeves. Dad in the kitchen. She appeared seconds later wearing a University of Wisconsin hoodie beneath a winter jacket. Neil noticed immediately she looked lighter than she had during Thanksgiving, less tense. Children always sensed fractures before adults admitted them aloud. Emily hugged him tightly. A real hug, not distracted, not rushed. "How was the drive?" Neil asked. "Terrible." She kicked snow from her boots near the doorway. Madison traffic was a disaster. Neil smiled faintly. Normal conversation. He valued normal conversation more than ever now. Emily looked around the kitchen carefully. "You changed stuff. Some. It feels different." Neil nodded once. "Yes." She studied him quietly for a second. "You okay?" Interesting. Everyone asked that question now, as if quiet men only became visible after surviving something publicly. Neil answered honestly. "Better." Emily smiled slightly at that, not fully convinced, but hopeful. Claire arrived 20 minutes later carrying a pie from a local bakery. She looked uncomfortable at first, standing in the entryway, almost uncertain whether she still belonged inside the house. Neil took the pie from her hands calmly. "Good to see you, Claire. You too." And he meant it. People who admitted silence mattered more than people who defended it forever. Doug Harper arrived last. Not because he had become close friends with Neil afterward, because after witnessing Saturday night he stopped pretending they were only neighbors. Funny how truth rearranged social distance. They sat together around the dining room table at 6:47 p.m. Same table, different room. No performance, no speeches, no strategic seating arrangements, just 4 people eating dinner while snow drifted quietly outside the windows. Neil noticed something immediately. Nobody reached for phones. Nobody monitored reactions. Nobody performed happiness. Emily talked about classes in Madison and a professor who terrified half her economics department. Doug complained about frozen pipes near his garage. Claire described a disastrous donor event where a guest accidentally backed into an ice sculpture. Ordinary stories. Neil listened more than he spoke. But unlike before, the silence no longer felt dismissive. It felt peaceful. Halfway through dinner, Emily looked around the room again. "You know," she said quietly, "this house feels more like home now." Nobody answered immediately, because everyone understood what she meant. Neil looked down briefly at his plate. Then toward the softly lit dining room walls, he painted himself. Warm gray. Simple. Clean. No staged elegance anymore, no pressure, just space. Claire finally spoke carefully. "Vanessa, Mrs. Emily." Emily nodded slightly. "I know." Neil remained silent, not out of resentment, out of boundaries. Claire noticed and changed subjects gently. Doug leaned back in his chair afterward, rubbing his stomach dramatically. "Best meal I've had in months." Emily laughed. "You're just saying that because Dad actually seasons food." Doug pointed toward her immediately. "Exactly." Neil smiled faintly, a real smile this time. Small, but real. Later that night, after everyone left, Neil stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes beneath warm water while snow continued falling outside. The house remained quiet, but not lonely. Different thing entirely. He dried his hands slowly and walked into the dining room once more. The table stood partially cleared now. Empty glasses, folded napkins, crumbs from bread near Doug's plate. evidence of people actually living inside the room. Neil rested one hand against the back of a chair. Same table where Vanessa announced her affair. Same room where Ethan sat believing confidence could overpower structure. Same place where humiliation was supposed to happen publicly. Instead, the room had survived them all. Funny. Neil looked toward the window. Snowflakes drifted steadily beneath the porch light outside. He thought briefly about everything Rebecca once told him. Protection before revenge. Documentation before confrontation. Peace before pride. She had been right. Not because preparation prevented pain. Nothing prevented pain. Preparation simply stopped pain from destroying everything else around it. Neil turned off the dining room light and stood for a moment in the soft darkness afterward. No anger remained now, not really. Only distance. And strangely enough, gratitude. Because the collapse finally forced truth into rooms where performance had lived too long. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. Emily. Forgot my gloves, LOL. Check kitchen counter. Neil looked toward the kitchen island and saw the gloves sitting there beside the breadbasket. He smiled faintly again. Normal problems. He preferred normal problems. Neil picked up the gloves and walked toward the front hallway, while warm light spilled softly through the quiet house behind him. And for the first time in years, Neil Hamilton no longer felt like a guest sitting at the edge of his own life. Sometimes the strongest people in a room are not the loudest ones. They are the people who stay calm long enough to see the truth clearly. Neil never won because he shouted louder, manipulated harder, or humiliated people back. He won because he stayed patient while everyone else underestimated him. He understood something many people learn too late. Emotions fade quickly, but decisions leave permanent consequences. A lot of people watching this story probably know what it feels like to be ignored, underestimated, or quietly disrespected while carrying responsibilities nobody notices. And sometimes the hardest part is realizing that love without respect slowly becomes performance. But this story is also a reminder that protecting your peace is not weakness. Preparing carefully is not coldness. Walking away calmly can take more strength than staying in chaos just to prove a point. If this story meant something to you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. In the comments, have you ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you? And when the truth finally came out, how did it change your life? And if you enjoy slow burn stories about betrayal, quiet strength, and smart justice, subscribe to the channel now. Tomorrow's story involves a family inheritance, a hidden signature, and one mistake that destroys everything.